In the summer of 1456, the greatest army ever assembled by the Ottoman Empire surrounded the fortress city of Belgrade with a ring of steel, fire, and ambition. Sultan Mehmed II, who 3 years earlier had shattered the thousand-year-old walls of Constantinople and brought the Roman Empire to its final bloody end, arrived with 150,000 men, 300 siege cannon, and the unshakable conviction that nothing could stop him from driving into the heart of Christian Europe. Defending the city was a 50-year-old Hungarian warlord who had spent 3 decades turning himself into the one thing the Ottomans feared more than God, a commander who could beat them at their own game. John Hunyadi had no royal blood, no inherited fortune, and no guarantee that the squabbling kingdoms of Europe would lift a finger to help him. What he had was 20,000 soldiers, half of them peasants who'd never held a sword, an alliance with a firebrand Italian monk who preached crusade to anyone who'd listen, and a tactical brilliance forged in the white heat of 40 battles against the most formidable military machine in the world. 11 days after achieving the impossible and breaking the siege of Belgrade, saving Christian Europe from almost certain conquest, Hunyadi was dead. Plague took him where Turkish scimitars could not. But in those 50 years, this son of a Wallachian, nobody had risen to become Regent of Hungary, the terror of sultans, and the architect of a military revolution that would echo through centuries. His story is one of impossible odds, brutal politics, spectacular victories, and catastrophic defeats, a tale of how one man's refusal to accept the inevitable changed the course of history and bought Western civilization the time it desperately needed to survive. The boy who would save Christendom was born into a world that didn't want him. Around 1406, the records are maddeningly vague, as they always are for people who aren't supposed to matter. John Hunyadi entered the world somewhere in Transylvania, that brutal crossroads where Hungarian, Romanian, Saxon, and Ottoman ambitions collided in a perpetual storm of raids, counter-raids, and massacres. His father was Wojciech, a Wallachian who'd done something impressive enough for King Sigismund of Hungary to grant him estates in Hunyadi. Exactly what Wojciech had done, or who he really was, became the subject of whispers that would follow John his entire life. Some said Wojciech was Sigismund's bastard son, making John quasi-royal blood. Others claimed Wojciech was just another minor noble who'd married well and fought better. The truth was probably somewhere in between, which meant John grew up in that dangerous middle space, too well-born to be dismissed entirely, too poorly connected to be accepted by Hungary's aristocratic elite. What mattered was the land itself. Hunyadi sat in the southern reaches of Transylvania, close enough to the Wallachian and Ottoman frontiers that childhood wasn't some pastoral idyll of hawks and horses. It was an education in survival. Turkish Akinci raiders, light cavalry whose job was to strike fast, burn everything, and disappear before anyone could organize a response, treated the borderlands like a hunting preserve. They came for slaves, gold, and terror, roughly in that order. A village that stood in spring might be ashes by summer. Children learned to recognize the dust clouds that meant riders were coming, learned which forests offered hiding places, learned that mercy was something you heard about in church but never actually saw. This was the crucible that forged Hunyadi, not some academy of chivalry, not the glittering courts of Buda or Vienna, but the desperate mathematics of frontier warfare where mistakes got you killed or worse, sold in a Constantinople slave market. He grew up watching his father and the local nobles organize hasty defenses, studying how the Turks fought, learning that the Ottomans weren't some faceless horde, but a supremely disciplined military machine that had been perfecting the art of conquest for over a century. They had better cavalry tactics, better intelligence networks, better logistics. They won because they deserved to win. And that was the most terrifying lesson of all. King Sigismund noticed the young man. Whether this was because John was actually his grandson, or simply because competence was rare enough to be valuable, The result was the same. John entered royal service in the 1420s. This was no act of nepotism. Sigismund was many things, but he hadn't built a career fighting the Ottomans by promoting incompetence. The king gave John opportunities, but opportunities in Sigismund's service meant leading men into situations where the Ottoman army outnumbered you 5-1 and retreat wasn't an option because Christian villagers were depending on you to not abandon them to enslavement. Sigismund was himself a fascinating study in contradiction, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, a man who'd led the catastrophic Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396, where the flower of French chivalry had charged straight into a Turkish trap and been slaughtered like cattle. That disaster had taught Sigismund what John was learning. Western European knights, for all their armor and pedigree, had no idea how to fight the Ottomans. They brought medieval tactics to a modern war and died heroically stupid deaths. The Turks, meanwhile, had refined warfare into something approaching science. Coordinated infantry and cavalry, massed archery, strategic retreats that lured overconfident Christians into ambushes, and a logistical system that could keep massive armies supplied deep in enemy territory. John absorbed these lessons with the intensity of someone who understood that theory without practice was just prayer in disguise. He studied the Ottoman order of battle, their use of light cavalry to screen heavier forces, their deployment of Janissaries, elite slave soldiers who fought with a discipline Western armies couldn't match. He learned Turkish, which was either pragmatic brilliance or vaguely scandalous depending on who you asked. Most importantly, he learned that beating the Turks required adopting their innovations while exploiting their weaknesses. You couldn't out-discipline the Janissaries, but you could use terrain they weren't expecting. You couldn't match their cavalry numbers, but you could hit their supply lines. You couldn't win by charging gloriously into the center of their army, but you could win by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than they expected Christians to be. Somewhere in this period, probably around 1429, John married Erzsébet Szilágyi, and this was the move that transformed him from talented soldier to genuine player in Hungarian politics. The Szilágyis were proper Magyar nobility, the kind of family that could trace their lineage back through centuries of Hungarian history. For Erzsébet to marry a Wallachian, even one in royal favor, was either a love match or a calculated gamble that John Hunyadi was going places. Given what happened next, probably both. The marriage gave John something money couldn't buy: legitimacy in the eyes of the Hungarian noble class, connections to the networks of power that ran through every significant decision in the kingdom, and children who would be unquestionably Hungarian, rather than outsiders tolerated on the frontier. It also gave him Erzsébet herself, who turned out to be exactly the kind of political operator a rising military commander needed. While John was campaigning, she managed estates, navigated court politics, and built alliances with the ruthless efficiency of someone who understood that her husband's enemies would destroy their family the moment John showed weakness. In a world where women's power operated through different channels than men's, Erzsébet became John's anchor to Hungarian political reality, the voice reminding him which nobles could be trusted, which were plotting against him, and which were too stupid to matter. By the late 1430s, John Hunyadi had become what the frontier demanded: a warrior who could think like a Turk, fight like a Hungarian, and politic like a man who knew that military victories meant nothing if your rivals stabbed you at court before you could capitalize on them. He'd survived raids, ambushes, and the casual brutality of border warfare. He'd gained Sigismund's trust not through blood, whatever the whispers said, but through competence. He'd married into legitimacy. He'd learned that the Ottoman Empire wasn't going to collapse from internal weakness or divine intervention, that Christendom's survival required men willing to match Turkish ruthlessness with Christian cunning. What he didn't yet know was that Sultan Murad II, was preparing to finish what his predecessors had started: the complete subjugation of the Balkans and the opening of the road to Hungary itself. That the old King Sigismund would soon die, leaving Hungary vulnerable and leaderless at precisely the wrong moment. That everything John had learned in the brutal schooling of the borderlands was about to be tested on a scale that would determine whether Christian Europe had a future or just a prolonged, bloody ending. The education was complete. The wars were about to begin, and the Wallachian wolf was ready to show the world what a man without the right bloodline could accomplish when survival itself demanded genius. King Sigismund died in December 1437, and with him died any illusion that Hungary had time to prepare for what was coming. The king had been the thread holding together a kingdom that barely functioned as a unified entity. Hungarian magnates, the great noble families who controlled vast estates and private armies, spent more time scheming against each other than governing. The Diet, Hungary's fractious assembly of nobles, could barely agree on what day it was, let alone coordinate a coherent defense policy. And now the throne passed to Sigismund's son-in-law, Albert of Habsburg, a capable enough ruler who had the misfortune of inheriting a kingdom at the exact moment the Ottoman Empire decided to remind everyone who actually controlled the Balkans. For John Hunyadi, now in his early 30s and holding the position of Ban of Severin, a military governorship on the southern frontier, the power vacuum was both opportunity and existential threat. The Ottoman war machine didn't pause for royal transitions. Sultan Murad II, who'd spent the 1430s consolidating Ottoman power, saw Hungary's weakness the way a predator sees a limping deer. Turkish raids intensified along the frontier. Serbian despots, caught between Ottoman pressure and Hungarian chaos, began hedging their bets, sending tribute to Constantinople while making increasingly hollow promises to Buda. The entire defensive architecture that Sigismund had spent decades building was crumbling in real time. Albert lasted less than 2 years. Dysentery killed him in October 1439, leaving Hungary with a pregnant widow, no clear heir, and Ottoman forces probing deeper into the kingdom's southern defenses. The magnates immediately split into factions. Some wanted to wait for Albert's posthumous son, the child who would be born as Ladislaus V. Others pushed for the young Polish king Władysław III to take the Hungarian throne, creating a massive Polish-Hungarian union that could theoretically marshal enough strength to push back against the Turks. The debate raged while villages burned and refugees streamed north with stories of Turkish brutality that would have seemed like exaggeration if they weren't so consistently, horrifyingly detailed. Hunyadi didn't wait for the nobles to finish arguing. He couldn't afford to. The southern frontier wasn't some abstract political problem. It was his responsibility, his land, his people being enslaved or slaughtered. In 1440, while Hungary's political class was paralyzed by succession crisis, Hunyadi began launching raids into Ottoman-held territory. Not defensive operations, not desperate holding actions, but aggressive strikes designed to prove something the Turks had stopped believing: that Christians could hurt them. These weren't the glorious cavalry charges that chroniclers love to describe. This was ugly, practical warfare, hitting Ottoman supply depots, ambushing isolated Turkish units, cutting off Akinci raiders before they could retreat with their human plunder. Hunyadi fought the way he'd learned on the frontier, using intelligence networks to track Turkish movements, choosing battlefields that negated Ottoman numerical advantages, and moving fast enough that enemy reinforcements always arrived too late. He lost battles. Everyone lost battles against the Ottomans. But he won enough to build a reputation as someone who understood that warfare against the Turks was about mathematics and psychology as much as courage. The magnates in Buda noticed. More importantly, the young Władysław III noticed. In 1440, the Polish king accepted the Hungarian crown, and one of his first major decisions was to recognize what Hunyadi had accomplished on the frontier. The new king needed military commanders who could actually deliver victories rather than just excuses, and the Wallachian upstart had results. Władysław was 17 years old, idealistic enough to believe crusade propaganda, but smart enough to recognize competence when he saw it. Hunyadi was appointed voivode of Transylvania in 1441, giving him command over one of Hungary's most strategically crucial regions. Now Hunyadi had resources, real armies, not just frontier militias. Transylvania's mixed population, Hungarians, Saxons, Romanians, required careful political management, but it also provided diverse military capabilities. The Saxons contributed disciplined infantry and crucial financial support. The Romanian border lords knew the terrain and the enemy. The Hungarian nobles brought heavy cavalry. Hunyadi welded them into something unprecedented: a Transylvanian army that could fight the Ottomans using their own tactical playbook. The test came in 1441 at Samandria, a Serbian fortress that the Turks had captured and fortified as a staging point for deeper incursions into Hungary. Hunyadi arrived with a force that contemporary sources wildly disagree about, anywhere from 5,000 to 15,000 men, which tells you everything about medieval record-keeping. What's not disputed is what happened next. Instead of laying siege to the fortress, which would have given the Ottomans time to bring overwhelming reinforcements, Hunyadi baited the Turkish garrison into a field battle. He deployed his forces in defensive positions, using wagons to create fortified points that disrupted Turkish cavalry charges, then counterattacked when the Ottoman formations broke themselves against his prepared defenses. The Turks at Samandria weren't expecting a Christian commander who understood Ottoman tactics better than they did. They expected desperate defenders or reckless attackers, not a methodical destruction of their army, followed by a siege that starved the fortress into submission. When Samandria fell, it wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a psychological earthquake. Christian forces had taken a fortified Ottoman position through superior generalship, not through overwhelming numbers or miraculous intervention. Hunyadi had proven that the Turks could be beaten by beating them at their own game. The victory reverberated across Europe. Here, finally, was a commander who could deliver what decades of crusade preaching had promised but never achieved: actual victories against the Ottoman Empire. Pope Eugene IV started paying attention. So did every court in Christendom that had spent the past century watching the Turks devour the Balkans piece by piece. Letters arrived in Buda suggesting larger campaigns, coordinated crusades, the liberation of the Balkans, the usual diplomatic fantasy that assumed European unity was possible and Ottoman collapse was imminent. Hunyadi knew better. He'd seen enough Turkish armies to understand that Samandria was a battle, not the war. Murad II commanded resources that dwarfed anything Hungary could mobilize: larger armies, better logistics, an empire with centuries of military tradition, and the economic base to support continuous campaigning. One fortress didn't change the fundamental calculus, but it did buy time, and time was the most precious resource Christendom had. Time to fortify defenses, time to recruit armies, time to convince the perpetually skeptical Hungarian nobles that maybe, just maybe, this Wallachian outsider knew what he was doing. The raids continued through 1442. Hunyadi pushed deeper into Ottoman territory, recapturing fortresses, disrupting Turkish supply lines, forcing Murad to divert forces from other campaigns to deal with this persistent Christian nuisance in the Balkans. Each victory brought more recruits to Hunyadi's banner, veterans who'd seen too many defeats and wanted to fight for someone who actually won. Each victory also brought more enemies at court, magnates who resented that a man without proper bloodline was accumulating power and prestige at an alarming rate. By late 1442, Hunyadi had been appointed Captain General of Hungary, second only to the king in military authority. It was a stunning rise for someone who'd started as a frontier commander of questionable parentage. It was also dangerous. The higher he climbed, the harder his enemies would work to bring him down. Hungarian politics was a zero-sum game where success bred envy and envy bred conspiracy. Hunyadi had proven he could beat the Turks on the battlefield. Now he'd have to learn whether he could survive the more subtle warfare of Magyar court politics. What he didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that young King Władysław was developing a taste for glory that would lead them all toward the greatest crusade in a generation. A campaign that would push deep into the heart of Ottoman territory, liberate ancient Christian lands, and either break the Turkish stranglehold on the Balkans forever, or end in catastrophe so complete it would haunt Hungary for centuries. The preliminary victories were over. The real war was about to begin, and John Hunyadi, the Wallachian wolf who'd clawed his way to command, was about to discover whether tactical brilliance was enough when kings started believing their own propaganda. The plan was insane, which was probably why it worked. In the autumn of 1443, Hunyadi proposed what no Christian army had successfully attempted in decades: a deep penetration strike into the heart of Ottoman-controlled Balkans, not to raid and retreat, but to liberate. The goal wasn't a border fortress or a defensive victory. It was to drive south through Serbia, smash Turkish armies wherever they could be found, and prove that Ottoman dominance in the region wasn't inevitable. It was the kind of strategy that looked brilliant if it succeeded and suicidal if it failed, with no middle ground. King Władysław loved it immediately, which should have been Hunyadi's first warning sign. The young king was 20 years old now, ruler of both Poland and Hungary, and infected with the peculiar brand of religious fervor that turns princes into crusaders. He'd grown up hearing stories about the fall of Constantinople. No, not the final fall that was still a decade away, but the shrinking, the slow strangulation of the Byzantine Empire by Ottoman conquest. He'd heard papal legates preach about the sacred duty to push back the Muslim tide. He'd watched Hunyadi win battle after battle on the frontier and developed the dangerous conviction that victory wasn't just possible, but divinely ordained. Youth and power are a volatile combination. Add religious certainty, and you get crusades. Hunyadi was more pragmatic. He knew this campaign could work because he'd studied Ottoman deployment patterns obsessively. Murad II had forces stretched across Anatolia, dealing with the Karamanids, a Turkish rival state that kept the Ottomans from concentrating their full strength in the Balkans. Serbian despots, ground between Hungarian and Ottoman millstones, might actually fight if they believed Christian victory was possible. The Wallachian voivode, Vlad II, Dracul, father of the future Vlad the Impaler, was making noise about supporting a Hungarian offensive. The pieces were aligned better than they'd been in years, possibly decades. The army that assembled in the summer of 1443 was the most formidable Christian force Hungary had fielded in a generation. Sources vary wildly on numbers. Medieval chroniclers couldn't count to save their lives. But somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000 men gathered under the Hungarian banner. Hunyadi commanded the main force, a mixed army of Hungarian cavalry, Transylvanian infantry, Saxon mercenaries, and Wallachian auxiliaries. Władysław brought Polish knights, whose armor and pedigree impressed everyone, but whose experience fighting Ottomans was approximately zero. Cardinal Julian Cesarini, the papal legate, came along to provide spiritual authority and ensure this was officially a crusade, which meant indulgences for the soldiers and diplomatic cover if things went wrong. They crossed into Ottoman territory in October, which violated every conventional military wisdom about campaign season. Armies didn't march in autumn because winter was coming, and supply lines became nightmares. But that's exactly why Hunyadi chose it. The Turks weren't expecting a major offensive as the weather turned cold. Surprise was worth more than comfort. The first major engagement came at Niš, an ancient Serbian city the Ottomans had held for decades. The Turkish garrison was substantial, but unprepared for the size and ferocity of Hunyadi's assault. He didn't bother with a prolonged siege. Time was the enemy as much as the Turks were. Instead, he coordinated a combined assault using his increasingly sophisticated integration of cavalry, infantry, and the war wagons that were becoming his signature tactical innovation. The wagons, arranged in defensive formations, provided mobile fortifications that could blunt Turkish cavalry charges while giving his own forces rally points during chaotic melees. Niš fell after 3 days of savage fighting. The liberation sent shockwaves through the region. Christians who'd lived under Ottoman rule for a generation suddenly saw Hungarian banners flying over their city. Serbian despots started calculating whether Hungary might actually be strong enough to protect them if they switched sides. Hunyadi knew the psychological impact was as important as the military victory. Every liberated city was proof that your Ottoman conquest wasn't permanent, that Christian armies could reverse what everyone had assumed was inevitable decline. They pushed south. Pirot fell. Then Sofia, the old Bulgarian capital. Each victory brought more local Christians to Hunyadi's banner. Bulgarians, Serbs, Wallachians, all the subject peoples of the Ottoman Balkans who'd been waiting for someone, anyone, who could actually win. The army swelled with volunteers who brought local knowledge and burning hatred of Turkish rule. It also brought challenges, feeding an expanding army in enemy territory, maintaining discipline among troops who wanted to plunder liberated cities, managing the expectations of local populations who thought Christian victory meant permanent liberation rather than a temporary reprieve. The Ottomans finally responded in force. Qasim Pasha, one of Murad's most capable commanders, assembled an army and moved to intercept the Hungarian advance. The battle that followed, sometimes called the Battle of Zlatitsa, though the exact location remains disputed, was Hunyadi's first real test commanding a full-scale field army against a major Ottoman force. Qasim Pasha deployed in the classic Ottoman formation, Akinci light cavalry screening the flanks, Sipahi heavy cavalry massed in the center, Janissary infantry held in reserve to exploit breakthroughs. It was the battle order that had won countless victories across Anatolia and the Balkans, refined through generations of conquest. Hunyadi knew it intimately because he'd studied every defeat Christian armies had suffered trying to break it. He didn't try to break it head-on. Instead, he used the terrain, a valley with forested hills on either side, to fragment the Ottoman formation. He positioned his war wagons to channel the Turkish cavalry into killing zones where massed crossbow and early gunpowder weapons could slaughter horses and riders before they could close to melee range. When Qasim's Sipahis charged, expecting the Christians to collapse under the weight of armored cavalry, they ran into coordinated defensive fire that turned their charge into a massacre. The Janissaries, seeing their cavalry stalled, advanced to retrieve the situation. This was exactly what Hunyadi had been waiting for. With the elite Ottoman infantry committed and their cavalry broken, he unleashed his own heavy cavalry, Polish and Hungarian knights whose armor and discipline could match anything the Turks fielded, in a flanking maneuver that rolled up the exposed Ottoman line. Qasim Pasha's army disintegrated. The survivors fled south, spreading panic through every Turkish garrison between Sofia and Edirne. Hunyadi had done more than win a battle. He dismantled a major Ottoman field army using tactics the Turks thought Christians were incapable of executing. The victory proved he wasn't just good at frontier skirmishes and siege warfare. He could command a major campaign army and beat the Ottomans' best commanders. The Christian army pushed deeper into the Balkans. They were now further into Ottoman territory than any hostile force since the empire's founding. Local Turkish beys were abandoning their positions, unsure if they should fight or negotiate. The road to Edirne, the Ottoman capital, lay open. Some of Władysław's advisors began whispering that they could actually do it, march on the capital, force Murad to terms. maybe even reclaim Constantinople itself. Hunyadi knew better. His supply lines were stretched impossibly thin. Winter was settling in with a vengeance, and the mountain passes back to Hungary would soon be impassable. His army was exhausted, victorious but ground down by continuous fighting and the logistics of operating hundreds of miles from friendly territory. Most critically, Murad II was now fully aware of the threat and would be concentrating his forces. The surprise was gone. Continuing south meant gambling everything on increasingly long odds. In December, as snow began falling in the mountain passes, Hunyadi made the hardest decision a victorious commander can make. He ordered retreat. Not rout, not flight, but a methodical withdrawal back toward Hungary with the army intact and laden with plunder and freed Christian prisoners. Some of Władysław's Polish knights grumbled about abandoning the momentum, about missing the chance to deliver a crushing blow to the Ottoman heartland. Hunyadi didn't care. He'd achieved the campaign's objectives, shattered Ottoman military prestige, liberated significant territory, proven Christian armies could win deep in enemy territory. Throwing that away, chasing fantasies of capturing Edirne, was how you turned victory into catastrophe. The march home was brutal. The Ottomans harassed the rearguard constantly, trying to turn an orderly retreat into a panicked rout. Supply wagons broke down on frozen roads. Men died from cold and exhaustion as much as from Turkish arrows. But the army held together because Hunyadi had planned the retreat as carefully as the advance, establishing supply caches, coordinating with local allies, maintaining discipline when exhausted men wanted to scatter towards safety. They crossed back into Hungarian territory in January 1444, having been on campaign for nearly 4 months. The losses were significant, but acceptable. The gains were extraordinary. Hunyadi had led the most successful Christian offensive against the Ottoman Empire in living memory. Cities had been liberated. A major Turkish army had been destroyed. The myth of Ottoman invincibility had been shattered by a Wallachian commander who understood that beating the Turks required thinking like them while fighting like a Christian. The long campaign made Hunyadi a European celebrity. Letters of congratulation arrived from Rome, Venice, France, even distant England. The Pope issued bulls praising the victory and calling for a larger crusade to capitalize on Ottoman weakness. Money and volunteers started flowing toward Hungary from across Christendom. Everyone wanted to be part of the next campaign, the one that would finish what Hunyadi had started. Sultan Murad II, meanwhile, was dealing with the political fallout of having a Hungarian army rampage through his empire. He'd been humiliated. His commanders had been beaten by an opponent everyone assumed was inferior. His subject populations had seen that Ottoman rule could be challenged. In February 1444, Murad sent envoys to Hungary proposing a 10-year peace treaty. The terms were astonishingly generous. Ottoman recognition of Serbian independence under Hungarian protection, massive territorial concessions in the Balkans, even reparations. The subtext was clear. Murad wanted peace because he couldn't afford another campaign like the one Hunyadi had just executed. It was everything Hungary had fought for. A decade of peace to rebuild, fortify, prepare for the next inevitable conflict. Hunyadi, the realist, knew it was the best deal they'd get. The Hungarian magnates, calculating the costs of continued war, agreed. Even Cardinal Cesarini, despite his crusading fervor, acknowledged the treaty's advantages. King Władysław signed the Treaty of Szeged in July 1444, swearing oaths on holy relics to uphold the peace with the Ottoman Empire. The treaty lasted approximately 3 months before everyone decided to break it. Because young kings and papal legates are excellent at convincing themselves that breaking sacred oaths is actually God's will when glory and territorial expansion are on the table, Hunyadi, who'd won the campaign that made the treaty possible, was about to discover that victory creates its own momentum, and that momentum could be as dangerous as any Ottoman army. The peace was dead. The next crusade was coming, and this time the Turks would be ready. The decision to break the treaty was made in a palace, not on a battlefield, which tells you everything about how disconnected the people making decisions were from the reality of fighting Turks. Cardinal Cesarini was the primary architect of the betrayal. The papal legate had watched Hunyadi's long campaign and drawn exactly the wrong conclusions. Not that Christian victories were possible through superior tactics and careful planning, but that God was clearly on their side, and therefore greater ambitions were divinely guaranteed. He had also received intelligence that changed the strategic calculus. Murad II, exhausted by the recent defeats and dealing with renewed Karamanid pressure in Anatolia, had abdicated in favor of his 12-year-old son Mehmed. The Ottoman Empire, Cesarini argued, was in unprecedented chaos. A child sultan, internal dissension, recent military humiliation. This was the moment to strike the killing blow. The argument had a certain logic if you ignored everything Hunyadi had learned about Ottoman resilience. Yes, Murad had abdicated. Yes, young Mehmed the who would later conquer Constantinople and become one of history's most formidable rulers, was currently a child. But the Ottoman system didn't collapse just because the Sultan changed. The administrative apparatus, the Janissary corps, the military command structure, all of it remained intact and operational. Moreover, breaking a sacred treaty signed on holy relics would alienate potential allies and give Murad the moral high ground. If he came out of retirement to deal with Christian oathbreakers, he'd be the wronged party defending his empire against faithless invaders. Hunyadi made these arguments. The Hungarian magnates, who'd finally stopped questioning his military judgment after the long campaign, listened. But Władysław was 21 years old, had tasted glory, and wanted more. Cesarini whispered in the young king's ear about Christian duty, about the opportunity to liberate Constantinople, about how history would remember the king who broke Ottoman power forever. Letters arrived from Venice and other Italian states promising naval support, money, coordination. The fantasy of a grand coalition was taking shape, the same fantasy that had preceded every failed crusade for the past century. The fatal argument came from an unexpected source: George Branković, the Serbian despot. Branković had been dispossessed by the Ottomans and desperately wanted his lands back. He appeared before the Hungarian court in late summer 1444, with maps, promises of Serbian support, and stories about Ottoman weakness that were exaggerated at best and fabricated at worst. But he told Władysław what the young king wanted to hear: that Serbia would rise in rebellion, that Bulgarian Christians would join them, that the Ottomans were on the verge of internal collapse, and one more push would shatter them completely. In September 1444, Hungary officially renounced the Treaty of Szeged. Cesarini provided the theological justification. Oaths to infidels weren't binding when breaking them served God's purposes. A convenient bit of casuistry that would haunt Christian diplomacy for generations. Władysław, convinced he was fulfilling his sacred duty, ordered mobilization. And Hunyadi, who knew this was a catastrophic mistake but was bound by loyalty and duty, began assembling another army. The force that marched south in late September was smaller than the long campaign army, perhaps 20,000 men, though sources disagree as usual. The Venetian fleet that had promised to blockade the Bosphorus and prevent Ottoman forces from crossing between Anatolia and Europe was supposedly in position. Serbian rebels were supposedly preparing to rise. A Wallachian contingent under Vlad Dracul was supposedly marching to join them. Every part of the plan depended on, supposedly, which should have terrified everyone involved. The march south was different from the long campaign, faster, more reckless, driven by the calendar as much as strategy. They needed to strike before winter and before Mehmed could fully respond to the treaty violation. Cities that had welcomed Hunyadi the previous year were now garrisoned by Turkish forces who'd spent the intervening months fortifying and preparing for exactly this scenario. The local Christian populations who'd celebrated liberation in 1443 were now cautious, having learned that Hungarian promises of permanent protection didn't mean much when winter forced armies back north. They pushed through Bulgaria toward the Black Sea coast. The plan, such as it was, called for linking up with the Venetian fleet near Varna, resupplying, then either marching on Edirne or waiting for Murad to come to them. Hunyadi's scouts were reporting troubling intelligence. The Serbian uprising hadn't materialized. Brankovic, despite his promises, was nowhere to be found. The Venetian fleet wasn't in position to blockade anything. Vlad Dracul's Wallachians had mysteriously failed to appear. Worse, Murad too hadn't stayed in retirement. The moment he'd learned about the treaty violation, the old sultan had emerged from his Anatolian retreat, reassumed command, and begun concentrating Ottoman forces. The Venetian fleet that was supposed to prevent him from crossing the Bosphorus had failed, whether through incompetence, bribery, or simple bad timing. The result was the same. Murad was coming with the full strength of the Ottoman Empire, and he was coming for revenge against the oath-breakers who'd shattered his peace. On November 9th, 1444, the two armies met near the port city of Varna on the Black Sea coast. The battlefield was a nightmare from Hunyadi's perspective. Open terrain that favored Ottoman cavalry. No natural defensive positions. No time to prepare fortifications. The Crusader army was exhausted from forced marching and running low on supplies. The Ottomans had somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 men. Exact numbers are impossible, but the consensus is they significantly outnumbered the Christians. Murad deployed with his customary excellence. Janissaries in the center behind a barrier of chained wagons and shields, Sipahi cavalry on the wings, Akinji light cavalry screening and ready to exploit any weakness. Hunyadi commanded the right wing, the most critical position, because it faced the elite Turkish cavalry. His deployment was characteristically sophisticated. War wagons to break cavalry charges, mixed formations of cavalry and infantry to provide mutual support, guns and crossbows positioned to create killing zones. If the Ottomans could be held until nightfall, there was a chance to retreat to Varna's fortifications and force a siege where Christian defensive advantages might balance Ottoman numbers. The battle began with the ritual bombardment, cannons on both sides firing with more noise than accuracy, arrows darkening the sky, light cavalry skirmishing to test enemy positions. Then the real fighting started. Ottoman Sipahis charged Hunyadi's right wing in waves, trying to overwhelm his defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers. This was exactly what he'd prepared for. His war wagons held, his cavalry countercharged at precisely calculated moments, disrupting Turkish formations before they could build momentum. His infantry, deployed in mutually supporting positions, prevented the Ottomans from exploiting gaps in the line. For hours, Hunyadi's wing held against everything the Turks threw at it. He was fighting the battle of his life, matching wits with Ottoman commanders who'd spent careers perfecting their craft. Every tactical innovation he'd developed over years of frontier warfare was being tested against the finest cavalry army in the world. And he was winning. The Ottoman right wing was stalling, taking casualties, failing to break through. If the rest of the Crusader army could match his performance, there was still a chance. Then Władysław ruined everything. The king, watching from the center, saw the Janissaries behind their wagon fortifications and made the catastrophic decision that has baffled historians for 6 centuries. He ordered a direct cavalry charge at the Ottoman center, not a tactical maneuver to exploit a weakness, not a coordinated assault with infantry support. A headlong charge by Polish and Hungarian knights straight at the most disciplined infantry in the world, defended by field fortifications and supported by massed archery. The reasons for this decision died with Władysław, but the speculation is instructive. Maybe he believed the Janissaries would break if confronted with true Christian courage. Maybe he'd spent too much time listening to stories about chivalric glory and not enough time learning that glory gets you killed when you charge prepared positions. Maybe he saw Hunyadi succeeding on the wing and wanted his own moment of heroism. Maybe, at 21 years old, commanding his first major battle, he simply panicked and chose action over patience. The charge was magnificent in the way doomed things often are. Polish knights in full armor, Hungarian cavalry with lances lowered, banners streaming, heading toward the Turkish center at full gallop. For a brief, insane moment, it seemed to work. The sheer audacity of the charge disrupted the Janissary line. Władysław and his bodyguards smashed through the initial defenses, driving deep into the Ottoman formation. The king was spotted fighting his way toward Murad's position, apparently believing he could end the battle by killing the Sultan personally, as if warfare was a tournament and killing the enemy leader meant automatic victory. He almost reached Murad. Almost. The accounts agree he got close enough to see the Sultan's standard. Then the Janissaries closed in from all sides. Władysław III, King of Poland and Hungary, was dragged from his horse and beheaded. His head was subsequently mounted on a pike and paraded before the Ottoman army. The cream of Polish chivalry died around him, cut down by Janissary swords and arrows in a killing zone they should never have entered. Hunyadi, still fighting on the wing, learned about the king's death from the chaos of a collapsing army. The center had evaporated. The Polish knights were dead or fleeing. The Hungarian infantry, seeing their king killed and the battle lost, were breaking. The Ottomans, sensing complete victory, were preparing to encircle and annihilate the entire Crusader army. This was the moment that separated great commanders from merely good ones. Hunyadi could have fought to the death, gone down in glory defending the lost cause. Instead, he did something harder. He saved what could be saved. He organized a fighting retreat, using his intact right wing as a rear guard, while the remnants of the Crusader army fled toward the Black Sea. He personally commanded the rear guard actions that prevented Ottoman cavalry from turning retreat into massacre. Men who were there later testified that Hunyadi was everywhere during the withdrawal, rallying broken units, coordinating defensive positions, buying time with his own life for other men to escape. The retreat became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Cardinal Cesarini, the man who'd pushed hardest for breaking the treaty, disappeared during the flight and was probably killed by Turkish cavalry or Bulgarian peasants seeking revenge. Hunyadi fought his way out through a gauntlet of Ottoman forces, but was captured by Vlad Dracul's Wallachians, nominally Christian allies who decided that imprisoning and ransoming Hungary's greatest commander was more profitable than helping him escape. The humiliation was complete. The king was dead. The army was destroyed. The architect of the campaign was captured by supposed allies. And Hunyadi, who'd opposed the entire disastrous venture from the start, was blamed by survivors for not somehow preventing the catastrophe that everyone else had created. He would spend the winter of 1444-45 as Vlad Dracul's prisoner, paying ransom while Hungary descended into chaos, and the Ottomans celebrated their greatest victory in a generation. The long campaign's achievements were erased. The Treaty of Szeged, broken with such confidence, was replaced by a worse peace that Murad dictated from a position of unquestionable strength. The Serbian despot Branković, who'd promised so much and delivered nothing, made his own peace with the Ottomans and would spend the next years plotting against Hungary. Varna became a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when ambition exceeds capability, and when young kings listened to priests instead of soldiers. It should have ended Hunyadi's career. The greatest military disaster in Hungarian history had occurred on his watch, even if he'd opposed it and fought brilliantly in a losing cause. Instead, when he finally returned to Hungary in early 1445, ransomed and furious, Hunyadi discovered that his reputation had somehow survived intact. Everyone knew he'd argued against the campaign. Everyone knew his wing had held while the king's foolishness lost the battle. And everyone knew that Hungary's survival now depended on the same Wallachian commander who just watched a generation of Hungarian nobility die because nobody had listened to him. The king was dead. The kingdom was leaderless. And the Ottomans knew that breaking Hungary was now just a matter of time and pressure. What they didn't know was that John Hunyadi, humiliated at Varna and imprisoned by supposed allies, was about to become more dangerous than ever. Because losing sometimes teaches more than winning, and the lessons learned in catastrophic defeat were about to be applied with ruthless precision. The warrior had become a regent. The battles were about to become wars. And the Ottomans were about to learn that Varna hadn't broken the man, it had just made him colder, smarter, and absolutely determined to ensure that no Christian army would ever again march to destruction, because kings believed in glory more than victory. Hungary was drowning in its own blood, and nobody could agree on who should stop the bleeding. The news from Varna hit Buda like a siege engine. King Władysław was dead, beheaded on a Bulgarian battlefield, his skull reportedly turned into a drinking cup for Ottoman celebrations, probably apocryphal, but the kind of story that spreads when defeat is so complete it requires embellishment. The Polish-Hungarian Union was shattered. The cream of Magyar nobility had been slaughtered charging Janissary positions because a 21-year-old king had confused courage with strategy. And the kingdom's greatest military commander was currently locked in a Wallachian fortress, being ransomed like common merchandise by an ally who'd failed to show up for the battle he'd promised to fight. The succession crisis was immediate and venomous. Legally, the heir was Ladislaus Posthumus, called Posthumus because he'd been born after his father Albert's death, which was either poetic or cruel depending on your perspective. The child was now 4 years old and currently in the custody of Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was treating the boy less like Hungary's future king and more like a valuable hostage to extract concessions. Frederick had no intention of releasing Ladislaus until Hungarian magnates agreed to terms that would effectively make Hungary a Habsburg dependency. The magnates split into factions with the speed and enthusiasm of sharks sensing blood. Some supported negotiating with Frederick, accepting vassalage in exchange for stability. Others wanted to elect a new king entirely, breaking the Habsburg claim and asserting Hungarian independence. A third faction argued for a regency council, multiple nobles sharing power until Ladislaus came of age, which would prevent any single family from becoming too dominant, but would also guarantee paralysis when decisive action was needed. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were sharpening their knives. Murad II had crushed the crusade at Varna, and now held every advantage. Hungarian prestige was destroyed. The Serbian despots had made peace with Constantinople. Wallachian voivodes were playing both sides, sending tribute to Murad while making hollow promises to Buda. The entire defensive architecture of Hungary's southern frontier, built painstakingly over decades, was crumbling because nobody in Buda could organize a coherent response while they were busy fighting over who got to wear the crown. Hunyadi returned to this chaos in early 1445, having finally paid his ransom to Vlad Dracul. The Wallachian voivode had extracted every ducat he could, holding Hungary's best commander prisoner while the kingdom hemorrhaged. It was a betrayal that Hunyadi filed away for future reference. He had an excellent memory for people who stabbed him in the back, and Wallachian politics would eventually feel the consequences. But first, he had to prevent Hungary from tearing itself apart. His position was paradoxical. He'd been the kingdom's captain general, but Władysław's death had technically ended that appointment. He held Transylvania as voivode, giving him control over one of Hungary's most strategically crucial regions, and the army that came with it. He'd opposed the Varna campaign and fought brilliantly in a losing cause, which gave him moral authority with people who actually understood military reality. But he was still a Wallachian upstart in the eyes of old Magyar families who believed power should flow through bloodlines, not competence. The magnates couldn't ignore him because he controlled the only functional military force between the Ottomans and the Hungarian heartland. They couldn't fully trust him because his power base was independent of the traditional noble networks. And they couldn't dismiss him because everyone knew that if the Turks decided to capitalize on Hungary's weakness, Hunyadi was the only commander who might stop them. The political maneuvering was Byzantine. Ulrich II of Chelyabinsk, a powerful noble who'd married into Hungarian influence, wanted the regency for himself. The Garai family, old Magyar aristocracy, believed their bloodline entitled them to dominance. Elizabeth of Luxembourg, Ladislaus's mother, claimed regency rights as the child's guardian despite being in Frederick's custody. Everyone was scheming, forming temporary alliances, making promises they wouldn't keep, and generally ensuring that Hungary couldn't respond coherently to external threats because it was too busy with internal warfare. Hunyadi navigated this snake pit with a pragmatism that would have made Machiavelli proud. He allied with the Palatine Laszlo Garai, temporarily to block Ulrich of Chelyabinsk's ambitions. He negotiated with Elizabeth while simultaneously preparing for the possibility she'd side with Frederick against Hungarian independence. He used his control of Transylvania as leverage. Anyone who wanted eastern defenses maintained needed Hunyadi's cooperation, which gave him veto power over decisions he opposed. He was learning that politics required the same strategic thinking as warfare, just with different weapons. The breakthrough came in June of 1446. The magnates, exhausted by 18 months of infighting and terrified by reports of Ottoman forces massing on the frontier, finally agreed to something. Hunyadi would serve as captain general again, with extraordinary powers to defend the kingdom. It wasn't the regency. That went to a compromise candidate, but it gave Hunyadi military authority, independent of the factional chaos in Buda. He could raise armies, fortify borders, and respond to Turkish threats without waiting for the Diet to finish arguing. It was enough. Barely. Hunyadi immediately began rebuilding the southern defenses that had been neglected during the succession crisis. He fortified key strongpoints along the Danube, rebuilt the network of scouts and spies that provided early warning of Ottoman movements, and purged commanders whose appointments had been political rather than meritocratic. He was ruthless about competence. Men who couldn't fight Turks effectively were replaced, regardless of their family connections or whose nephew they were. This made him new enemies among the nobility, but Hunyadi had apparently decided that being feared was more useful than being liked. The real test came in 1448. Murad II, having consolidated his position and dealt with Anatolian threats, decided the time had come to finish what Varna had started. He would invade Hungary, crush its armies, and reduce the kingdom to an Ottoman client state. The target was Serbia, still nominally independent but wavering under Ottoman pressure. If Serbia fell completely, the road to Buda would be open. Hunyadi knew he had to act. Letting the Ottomans absorb Serbia meant the next war would be fought on Hungarian soil. But he also knew that marching into the Balkans with an army had ended catastrophically at Varna. The political class in Buda was already murmuring that maybe another Balkan campaign wasn't wise, that maybe Hungary should focus on defense, that maybe Hunyadi's aggressive strategy would lead to another disaster. He assembled an army anyway. Not the grand crusading host of Varna, but a professional force of around 25,000, 30,000 men. Hungarian cavalry, Transylvanian infantry, mercenaries from across Central Europe, and a corps of veterans who'd fought with Hunyadi before and understood his tactical methods. He secured Wallachian support, though support from Vlad Dracul was always conditional and potentially treacherous. He coordinated with Serbian despot Đurađ Branković, the same man who'd betrayed the Varna campaign with false promises, because Balkan politics meant yesterday's traitor was today's ally when the Ottomans threatened everyone equally. The campaign began in September 1448. Hunyadi led his army south through Serbia, heading toward Kosovo, the same field where Serbian forces had been crushed by the Ottomans in 1389, creating the foundation myth of Serbian defeat and Ottoman dominance in the Balkans. It was strategically important, but also symbolically charged. Victory at Kosovo would reverse 60 years of psychological warfare. Defeat would confirm Ottoman supremacy and probably end Hungarian resistance for a generation. Murad II met him there with an army that sources estimated anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000 men. The exact numbers are lost to propaganda and poor record-keeping, but the consensus is clear. Hunyadi was significantly outnumbered by a force commanded by one of the era's most capable sultans on terrain that favored Ottoman cavalry, with supply lines that were dangerously extended and allies who might betray him at any moment. The Second Battle of Kosovo lasted 3 days. 3 days of the most savage fighting Hunyadi had experienced in a career built on savage fighting. The Ottomans deployed with their usual excellence, Janissaries anchoring the center, Sipahi cavalry on the wings, light cavalry harassing and probing for weaknesses. Murad had learned from previous encounters with Hunyadi. He knew the Hungarian commander's tactics and had prepared counters. Hunyadi fought with everything he'd learned: war wagons to break cavalry charges, coordinated infantry and cavalry to prevent Ottoman flanking maneuvers, massed firepower from guns and crossbows to disrupt Turkish formations. He was matching wits with Murad II in a chess match played with thousands of lives, each commander trying to force the other into a fatal mistake. On the first day, Hunyadi's right wing achieved a significant breakthrough, shattering part of the Ottoman line and threatening to roll up Murad's flank. For a few hours, victory seemed possible. Then the Serbian forces, supposedly allied with Hungary, either retreated or switched sides entirely, depending on which source you believe. Branković had betrayed them again, or his forces had simply broken under Ottoman pressure, or he'd been playing both sides all along. The result was the same. Hunyadi's flank was suddenly exposed. The second day was desperate defensive fighting. Hunyadi contracted his lines, using his war wagons to create fortified positions that the Ottomans couldn't easily overrun. He was buying time, hoping for nightfall or reinforcements or some development that would change the calculus. None came. The Wallachian contingent, seeing the battle turning against Hungary, began to waver. Mercenaries started calculating whether their contracts required dying in Kosovo or just fighting until retreat became necessary. On the third day, October 19, 1448, Murad launched a coordinated assault that finally broke the Hungarian positions. Not through superior tactics, Hunyadi's defensive formations were holding, but through attrition. His army was exhausted, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition and supplies. The Ottomans could rotate fresh troops into the line. Hunyadi couldn't. When his positions finally collapsed, it wasn't a dramatic breakthrough but a slow crumbling as units fell back, rallied, fell back again, until organized resistance became impossible. Hunyadi ordered retreat while he still had an army to retreat with. The withdrawal was another nightmare. Ottoman cavalry pursuing, local populations hostile or indifferent, the survivors traumatized by 3 days of carnage. He'd lost perhaps a third of his army, killed or captured. The rest made it back to Hungarian territory through a combination of Hunyadi's tactical skill and Ottoman exhaustion. And then came the final humiliation. He was captured again. Not by the Turks this time, but by Serbian forces loyal to Brankovic, the same despot who'd promised support, and then either betrayed Hungary or failed catastrophically. Depending on interpretation, Hunyadi spent weeks as Brankovic's prisoner, the greatest Christian military commander held hostage by a Christian despot who was playing both sides to protect his own shrinking territory. The ransom this time was political as well as financial. Brankovic extracted concessions, promises, Hungarian recognition of Serbian territorial claims. All the leverage a small power could extract from a larger one, when circumstances temporarily inverted the power relationship. Hunyadi paid it, returned to Hungary in early 1449, and discovered that his enemies had been busy during his captivity. Kosovo was being portrayed as another Varna, Hunyadi's reckless aggression leading to catastrophic defeat. The magnates who'd opposed his appointment as captain general saw vindication. Whispers spread through Buda that maybe the Wallachian upstart wasn't the military genius everyone thought, that maybe his earlier victories had been luck, that maybe Hungary needed different leadership. Ulrich of Celje, who'd been scheming for greater power, saw an opportunity to diminish Hunyadi's influence and elevate his own. Hunyadi's response was characteristically direct. He didn't defend himself with words or political maneuvering. Instead, he pointed out the mathematical reality that everyone wanted to ignore. He'd held Kosovo for 3 days against superior Ottoman forces without Serbian support, had conducted an organized retreat that preserved most of his army, and had prevented Murad from capitalizing on victory with a follow-up invasion of Hungary. Kosovo was a defeat, yes, but it was a defeat that had cost the Ottomans so dearly that Murad decided pursuing Hungary further wasn't worth the casualties. It was a strategic victory, disguised as a tactical defeat, though few in Buda wanted to acknowledge this. What they couldn't ignore was that Ottoman armies weren't currently pouring across the frontier, that southern defenses were holding, and that Murad II had decided consolidating his Balkan gains was more profitable than fighting Hunyadi again. By 1450, the political situation in Hungary had reached an absurd equilibrium. Ladislaus was still in Frederick's custody. The magnates were still fighting over who should rule until the boy came of age. And everyone had reluctantly concluded that Hunyadi, despite being a Wallachian outsider with 2 major defeats on his record, was the only person keeping the kingdom from complete collapse. In 1451, the Diet made it official. John Hunyadi was appointed Regent of Hungary, the first man without royal blood to hold such power in the kingdom's history. His enemies raged but couldn't prevent it. His supporters celebrated but understood the precariousness of his position. And Hunyadi himself accepted the regency, knowing it made him the target of every ambitious noble in Hungary and every Ottoman commander who wanted to finish what Varna and Kosovo had started. He was 50 years old, scarred by decades of warfare, betrayed repeatedly by supposed allies, blamed for defeats that others had caused, and now responsible for governing a kingdom that barely functioned as a coherent entity. The Wallachian wolf had climbed to the top of the Hungarian political hierarchy through sheer, bloody-minded competence. Now he had to figure out how to keep the kingdom alive long enough for it to matter. The Ottomans were watching. The magnates were scheming. And John Hunyadi, Regent of Hungary, was about to discover that ruling was harder than fighting, but that sometimes, when the wolves circled close enough, the skills were surprisingly similar. The regency was a knife fight conducted in silk robes and Latin. Hunyadi held power in 1451, but holding power in medieval Hungary meant constantly defending it against magnates who believed their bloodlines entitled them to rule over a Wallachian upstart. Every decision was contested. Every appointment was scrutinized. Every military expenditure was questioned by nobles who resented paying for border defenses that protected their estates from Turkish raids. The Hungarian Diet, that fractious assembly of aristocrats who confused obstruction with governance, spent more time arguing about Hunyadi's authority than addressing the existential threat sitting on their southern border. Ulrich II of Celje was the most dangerous opponent. He'd married into Hungarian influence, accumulated vast estates, and nurtured ambitions that stretched far beyond his actual capabilities. Ulrich saw the regency as rightfully his. He had better bloodlines, stronger connections to European royal houses, and a sense of entitlement that made him genuinely believe Hunyadi's competence mattered less than his own aristocratic pedigree. The fact that Ulrich had never won a battle against the Ottomans, had never commanded armies in the field, and had never risked his life defending the kingdom was irrelevant in his calculation. Power, in Ulrich's worldview, belonged to those born to wield it. The conflict between them played out in council chambers and political maneuvering rather than battlefields. Ulrich controlled votes in the Diet, had allies among the great noble families, and excelled at the kind of bureaucratic warfare that drove Hunyadi to barely concealed rage. Every military initiative required Diet approval. Every appointment could be blocked by factional politics. Hunyadi would plan campaigns to strengthen border defenses, and Ulrich would organize opposition, claiming the regent was exceeding his authority or wasting kingdom resources on personal glory. What Ulrich didn't understand, what most of the Hungarian nobility didn't understand, was that the Ottomans weren't waiting for Hungary to finish its internal political theater. Murad II had died in 1451, and his son Mehmed II had assumed the throne for the second time. This wasn't the 12-year-old boy who'd briefly ruled during his father's abdication. This was a 19-year-old sultan with something to prove, commanding an empire at the height of its power, and nursing ambitions that would reshape the world. Mehmed's first target was Constantinople itself. The great city, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, had been shrinking for centuries, reduced to little more than Constantinople proper and a few surrounding territories, surrounded by Ottoman lands on all sides. Everyone knew the city would eventually fall. The question was when and whether Christian Europe would do anything to prevent it. Hunyadi understood the strategic implications immediately. If Constantinople fell, the Ottomans would control both sides of the Bosphorus, the critical strait between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Ottoman power would be unchallengeable in the region. The psychological impact on Christian populations living under or near Ottoman rule would be devastating. And Mehmed would be free to turn his full attention to Hungary without worrying about Byzantine complications on his flank. He tried to organize a relief expedition, sent letters to Rome, to Venice, to every Christian power that claimed to care about Christendom's eastern bulwark, offered to lead Hungarian forces to Constantinople's defense if other kingdoms would contribute men and supplies. The responses ranged from hollow promises to complete silence. Venice was more interested in negotiating favorable trade terms with the Ottomans than fighting them. The Pope issued calls for crusade that everyone ignored. The Italian states squabbled among themselves. Nobody was coming. Mehmed laid siege to Constantinople in April 1453, with an army that sources estimate at anywhere from 50,000 to 150,000 men. Medieval chroniclers couldn't count reliably, but the consensus is overwhelming force. He brought the largest cannons ever cast, designed specifically to shatter Constantinople's legendary walls. The city's defenders numbered perhaps 7,000, led by the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine the Botexth, who understood he was defending a corpse, but defended it anyway because what else could he do? The siege lasted 7 weeks. Hunyadi received reports through his intelligence network, spies, merchants, refugees fleeing the inevitable. The walls were being pounded to rubble. The Byzantines were fighting with desperate courage but couldn't hold indefinitely. Emperor Constantine had sent final pleas for help that went unanswered by everyone except a few hundred Genoese and Venetian volunteers who'd chosen honor over survival. The end was coming. On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell. The Ottomans poured through breaches in the walls that had protected the city for over 1,000 years. Emperor Constantine V died fighting in the streets, refusing to abandon his city, even when defeat was certain. The great churches were converted to mosques. The population was enslaved or massacred. A civilization that traced its lineage directly to Augustus Caesar was erased in a day of systematic conquest. The news reached Buda in June, and Hunyadi watched the Hungarian political class completely miss the point. The magnates treated Constantinople's fall as distant tragedy, something unfortunate but not directly relevant to Hungarian interests. Some even calculated it might be advantageous. Maybe Mehmed would be satisfied with his great conquest. Maybe the Ottomans would focus on consolidating new territories rather than pushing further into Christian Europe. Hunyadi knew better. Mehmed II hadn't conquered Constantinople to stop there. He'd done it to remove the last obstacle between the Ottoman Empire and complete dominance of southeastern Europe. The psychological barrier was gone. The city that had survived every siege for a millennium had fallen, proving Ottoman superiority was absolute. And the young sultan, having achieved at 19 what his predecessors had failed to accomplish, wasn't going to retire to palace comforts. He was going to keep conquering until someone stopped him. That someone would have to be Hunyadi, because nobody else was capable or willing. The regent threw himself into defensive preparations with renewed urgency. He fortified Danube crossings, expanded the network of border fortresses, improved intelligence gathering to get early warning of Ottoman movements. He reformed military recruitment, creating a more professional army less dependent on noble levies that might not show up when needed. He imported the latest military technology, better cannons, improved handguns, updated fortification designs, anything that might offset Ottoman numerical advantages. The political opposition intensified. Every reform threatened someone's privileges. Better armies meant higher taxes on nobles who resented paying. Professional soldiers meant less reliance on aristocratic cavalry, which reduced noble military importance. Fortification improvements cost money that magnates wanted, spent on court luxuries or their own estates. Ulrich of Kelje organized parliamentary opposition, built coalitions among resentful aristocrats, and framed every Hunyadi initiative as tyrannical overreach by a low-born upstart. The conflict came to a head in 1453 to 1454. Ladislaus V was now 13 years old, still in Frederick III's custody, but approaching the age where he could theoretically rule. Ulrich began maneuvering to secure the boy's release, calculating that a young, inexperienced king would be easier to manipulate than Hunyadi. The regent's enemies saw an opportunity: get Ladislaus to Buda, end the regency, reduce Hunyadi to his position as voivode of Transylvania, and return power to the proper aristocratic families. Hunyadi fought back, but his weapons were limited. He couldn't simply arrest Ulrich without triggering civil war. He couldn't ignore the Diet's constitutional authority without alienating potential allies. He couldn't abandon his military responsibilities to focus on court politics because the Ottoman threat was real and immediate. He was fighting a two-front war: Ottomans on the border, Hungarian nobles in Buda, and had insufficient resources for either. The compromise that emerged in 1454 was typically Byzantine. Ladislaus V would be brought to Hungary, ending Frederick's custody. Hunyadi would step down as regent, but retain his position as captain general and voivode of Transylvania, maintaining military authority while surrendering political supremacy. The king would theoretically rule with the Diet's guidance, which in practice meant faction fighting would paralyze decision-making, while everyone pretended constitutional order had been restored. Hunyadi accepted it because the alternative was civil war, and civil war would destroy Hungary more surely than any Ottoman invasion. He'd accomplished what he could as regent, strengthened defenses, professionalized the army, bought time for the kingdom to survive. Now he'd focus on what he did best, fighting Turks. But surrendering the regency meant surrendering protection from his enemies. As regent, attacking Hunyadi meant attacking Hungary's government. As captain general, he was just another powerful noble who could be undermined, isolated, and eventually destroyed through political means. Ulrich and his allies immediately began the process, working to reduce Hunyadi's military authority, questioning his appointments, blocking funding for border defenses. The situation was approaching crisis when Mehmed II provided clarity in the way only an existential threat can. In 1455, intelligence reports confirmed what Hunyadi had feared. The Ottomans were preparing a massive invasion of Hungary. Not a raid, not a border conflict, but a full-scale assault designed to do what Murat II had failed to accomplish: break Hungarian resistance and reduce the kingdom to an Ottoman vassal state. The target was Belgrade, the great fortress city controlling the Danube approaches to Hungary. If Belgrade fell, the entire southern frontier would collapse. The road to Buda would be open. The Ottomans could pour armies into the Hungarian heartland, and there was no defensive line strong enough to stop them. Mehmed II, fresh from conquering Constantinople, was coming personally to finish what his father had started. He was bringing the full might of the Ottoman Empire, the armies that had shattered the Byzantine Empire, the cannons that had breached the walls of Constantinople, the Janissaries who'd never lost a siege they were determined to win. Sources suggest anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 men, the largest Ottoman army ever assembled for a Hungarian campaign. Defending Belgrade was Hunyadi, with perhaps 25,000, 30,000 soldiers, half of them poorly trained peasants recruited in desperation when the Hungarian nobility refused to provide adequate levies. No European kingdom was sending reinforcements. The Pope issued another call for crusade that everyone ignored. The Venetians were negotiating trade deals with the Ottomans. The great Christian powers of Europe had decided that Hungarian survival wasn't worth the cost of intervention. It was July 1456. Mehmed II was marching north with irresistible force. The Hungarian political class was still arguing about whether funding Belgrade's defense was constitutionally appropriate. And John Hunyadi, 50 years old and exhausted from 3 decades of fighting impossible odds, was preparing for the battle that would determine whether Christian Europe survived or became an Ottoman province. Everything he'd learned, every tactic developed on the frontier, every lesson from victory and defeat, every innovation he'd pioneered, would be tested against the greatest military machine in the world, commanded by a sultan who'd already proven he could conquer the unconquerable. The siege of Belgrade was about to begin. The old lion would face the young conqueror, and the outcome would echo through centuries, reshaping the boundary between Christian and Muslim Europe in ways that neither commander could fully anticipate. The wars were over. The legend was about to begin. And everything, Hungarian survival, European security, Hunyadi's entire life's work, came down to one desperate defense of one fortress against impossible odds. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of situation where John Hunyadi did his best work. The spy's report was concise and terrifying. Mehmed was bringing everything. Hunyadi read the intelligence in his fortress headquarters, comparing multiple sources to separate Ottoman disinformation from actual threat assessment. The numbers were staggering even by Ottoman standards. The main army, somewhere between 80,000 and 150,000 men, depending on which intelligence network you trusted, was moving north through Bulgaria with military precision that would have impressed Caesar. The artillery train alone was unprecedented. Over 300 cannons, including the massive bombards that had reduced Constantinople's walls to rubble. The Danube flotilla numbered 200 vessels, a river navy designed to control the waterway and prevent relief forces from reaching Belgrade by boat. Mehmed II wasn't planning a siege. He was planning an execution. The Sultan was 24 years old now, 3 years past his conquest of Constantinople, and operating with the absolute confidence of someone who'd already achieved what generations of Ottoman rulers had failed to accomplish. He'd spent those 3 years consolidating power, crushing rivals, and preparing for this moment, the subjugation of Hungary and the opening of the road to Vienna. Belgrade was the key. The fortress city sat at the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, a strategic choke point that controlled access to the Hungarian heartland. Take Belgrade, and Hungary's southern defenses collapsed. Take Belgrade, and Christian Europe's last significant military barrier disappeared. Hunyadi studied maps by candlelight, calculating angles of approach and defensive possibilities with the obsessive detail of someone who understood that small mistakes meant catastrophic consequences. Belgrade's fortifications were formidable. Thick walls, strategic towers, the rivers providing natural moats on two sides. But formidable meant nothing to the cannons that had shattered Constantinople. The Byzantines had believed their walls were impregnable too, right up until Ottoman artillery reduced them to gravel. The garrison commander at Belgrade was uncertain. Exact records are lost. But Hunyadi knew the fortress held perhaps 5,000 to 7,000 defenders, mostly local militia, and whatever professional soldiers could be spared. Against 100,000 Ottomans and the most advanced siege artillery in the world, they'd last maybe 2 weeks. Maybe less if Mehmed pressed hard and was willing to accept casualties. Hunyadi needed an army. Not the garrison defenders who die heroically before being overwhelmed, but a relief force large enough to break the siege from outside. He sent urgent messages to the Diet in Buda, requesting mobilization of the kingdom's military resources. The response was a masterclass in bureaucratic obstruction, dressed as constitutional procedure. The magnates wanted to know who would pay for mobilization. They questioned whether Belgrade was worth defending or if resources should be concentrated closer to Buda. They debated whether Hunyadi's authority as captain general included commanding noble levies without royal authorization. They did everything except actually provide the army Hungary needed. Young King Ladislaus V, now 15 years old and theoretically ruling, was useless. The boy had spent his formative years in Frederick III's custody, learning courtly manners and political caution instead of leadership and decision-making. Faced with the greatest crisis of his nominal reign, Ladislaus deferred to advisors who were more interested in factional advantage than survival. Ulrich of Celje whispered in his ear that Hunyadi was exaggerating the threat to increase his own power, that committing kingdom resources to Belgrade was premature, that perhaps negotiation with the Ottomans was wiser than confrontation. Hunyadi recognized the pattern. This was Varna again. Political paralysis while the enemy approached with overwhelming force. Except this time, there was no young king eager for glory to override the caution. This time, the political class had learned the wrong lessons, deciding that avoiding another Varna meant avoiding decisive action entirely. So Hunyadi did what he'd done his entire career when the institutions failed. He improvised. He couldn't raise a conventional army from Hungarian nobility who wouldn't mobilize. But Hungary's population wasn't just nobility. The kingdom teemed with peasants, townspeople, minor gentry, people who'd never been considered military assets because medieval warfare was supposed to be the exclusive domain of aristocratic cavalry. These were the people who'd suffer most when Ottoman raiders arrived, who'd be enslaved or killed when Turkish forces swept north. They had more reason to fight than nobles safely ensconced in distant estates. The catalyst arrived in an unexpected form. Giovanni da Capistrano, a 70-year-old Franciscan friar who'd built a career on apocalyptic preaching and religious fervor. Capistrano had been touring Hungary since 1455, delivering sermons about the Ottoman threat and the sacred duty to defend Christendom. He was a religious fanatic, convinced God would provide victory if Christians fought with sufficient faith. His sermons were theologically dubious and strategically naive. They were also incredibly effective at motivating people whom rational military planning had failed to inspire. Hunyadi saw the opportunity and seized it. He couldn't give the Hungarian peasantry military training in the weeks remaining before Mehmed arrived, but Capistrano could give them religious conviction, and sometimes conviction mattered more than training. The friar's preaching was recruiting thousands of volunteers, farmers, craftsmen, minor nobles, anyone willing to defend their homes against the Turkish invasion. They had no armor, minimal weapons, and almost no military experience. What they had was desperation and the furious energy of people who'd been told their survival depended on aristocrats who weren't coming to save them. By late June 1456, Hunyadi had assembled something unprecedented, an army of approximately 20,000 to 25,000 men, roughly half of them Capistrano's peasant crusaders. It was a bizarre military force, professional soldiers who'd fought with Hunyadi for years, marching alongside farmers carrying improvised weapons and religious fervor. The Hungarian military establishment looked at this rabble and saw disaster. Hunyadi looked at them and saw the only chance Belgrade had. He moved south toward Belgrade in early July, racing against time and Ottoman advance forces. The logistics were nightmarish, feeding 20,000 men on the march, maintaining cohesion between professional soldiers who understood military discipline and religious volunteers who understood only that God demanded they fight Turks. Hunyadi deployed his veterans as the army's skeleton, using experienced soldiers to provide structure for the peasant masses. Capistrano marched with them, delivering sermons at every stop, maintaining the religious fervor that kept the volunteers from deserting when they realized they were marching towards the most powerful army in the world. The Ottomans reached Belgrade first. By July 4th, Mehmed's advance forces had surrounded the fortress and begun establishing siege positions. The main army arrived days later, a host so vast that it took hours for the entire force to deploy. The artillery train required special roads to be constructed just to move the massive bombards into firing positions. The Danube flotilla blockaded the river approaches, cutting Belgrade off from waterborne relief. Mehmed deployed with the methodical precision of someone who'd studied siege warfare under the best Ottoman engineers. The cannons were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would systematically reduce Belgrade's walls to rubble. Siege towers were being constructed to allow assault forces to bypass breached sections and attack the fortress directly. Trenches were being dug to protect approach routes and minimize defender advantage. The Sultan was engineering Belgrade's fall with the same systematic efficiency he'd brought to Constantinople. Inside the fortress, the garrison commander, historical sources suggest it was Michael Silagi, Hunyadi's brother-in-law, though this is disputed, organized defensive preparations with grim determination. They had supplies for perhaps a month, if rationed carefully. The walls were being reinforced where possible. Every able-bodied person in the city was being organized for defense. Loading weapons, carrying water to fight fires from bombardment, preparing medical supplies for the wounded. Everyone understood the mathematics. The garrison couldn't defeat the Ottoman army, but they could buy time for Hunyadi to arrive with relief forces. Hunyadi approached Belgrade on July 14th, leading his peculiar army down the Danube. He could see the Ottoman siege from miles away, the smoke from cooking fires and artillery testing, the geometric precision of siege trenches, the forest of tents and banners that marked one of the largest military encampments in history. What he saw confirmed his intelligence. This was the full might of the Ottoman Empire, concentrated on a single objective with overwhelming force. His first problem was the river blockade. Mehmed's fleet controlled the Danube, preventing approach by water and strangling Belgrade's supply lines. Hunyadi needed to break that blockade, or his entire relief force would be stuck on the wrong side of the river, able to watch Belgrade fall, but unable to prevent it. What happened next was either tactical brilliance or inspired madness, depending on perspective. Hunyadi assembled every river vessel he could find. Fishing boats, cargo barges, anything that floated. He loaded them with his best soldiers, some of Capistrano's more enthusiastic volunteers, and whatever ranged weapons could be scrounged. Then, on July 14th, he led this improvised river fleet directly at the Ottoman blockade. The Turkish fleet expected easy victory. They had 200 warships designed for river combat, facing a ragtag collection of civilian vessels. What they got was chaos. Hunyadi's boats rammed the Ottoman fleet with reckless abandon, soldiers boarding Turkish vessels in hand-to-hand combat, while the peasant crusaders fired crossbows and early firearms from anything that provided cover. The Franciscan volunteers fought with suicidal courage, apparently convinced God would protect them, or that dying while killing Turks guaranteed salvation. The naval battle was complete disorder. Medieval river warfare was always chaotic, and this engagement was particularly insane. But insanity worked in Hunyadi's favor. The Ottoman fleet, designed for coordinated operations, couldn't respond effectively to the sheer unpredictability of peasants ramming warships with fishing boats. By nightfall, Hunyadi had broken through the blockade, sinking or capturing dozens of the Turkish vessels and opening the river approach to Belgrade. Mehmed II watched this development from his command tent and apparently experienced his first serious doubt about the campaign. The intelligence had suggested Hunyadi might attempt relief with a small professional force that could be easily destroyed. Nobody had mentioned a religious fanatic leading 20,000 volunteers in a river assault that succeeded through sheer audacity rather than military logic. Hunyadi used the night to reinforce Belgrade, moving troops and supplies into the fortress under cover of darkness. The garrison, which had been preparing for heroic last stands, suddenly had 15,000 additional defenders and a commander who'd beaten the Ottomans more times than anyone alive. The mathematics of the siege had changed. Not enough to guarantee victory, but enough to make the outcome uncertain. Mehmed responded by escalating the bombardment. July 15-20 saw the most intensive artillery barrage of the campaign. The massive bombards fired continuously, each shot sending stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds into Belgrade's walls with force that made the entire fortress shake. Sections of wall collapsed, towers crumbled. The defenders worked frantically to repair breaches faster than Ottoman artillery could create them, knowing that once the walls fell completely, the Janissaries would pour through and the fortress would be lost. Inside Belgrade, Hunyadi coordinated the defense with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime preparing for exactly this scenario. He rotated troops to prevent exhaustion, positioned his best soldiers at the most vulnerable breach points, organized the civilians to support the garrison in whatever capacity they could manage. Capistrano, meanwhile, walked the walls during bombardments, delivering sermons and performing blessings, while stone balls shattered buildings around him. The friar's fearlessness, or insanity, was genuinely inspiring to defenders who needed to believe divine protection was real. By July 21st, Mehmed had created the breaches he needed. The walls were broken in multiple locations. The garrison was exhausted from constant bombardment and repair work. The time had come for the final assault, the moment when the Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers who'd never failed to take a fortress they were ordered to conquer, would pour through the breaches and reduce Belgrade to Ottoman control. The Sultan ordered the assault for the following day. Everything was prepared. The Janissaries were assembled in their assault formations. The Sipahi cavalry was positioned to exploit the breakthrough once the fortress fell. Mehmed II, Conqueror of Constantinople, was hours away from crushing Hungarian resistance and opening the road to Christian Europe's heartland. What he didn't know, what nobody knew, was that on July 22nd, 1456, something would happen that defied every military prediction and strategic calculation. A spontaneous action by forces nobody controlled would transform a hopeless defensive siege into the most improbable Christian victory of the century. The old lion and the young sultan were about to collide, and the world was about to discover that sometimes, when everything seems lost, desperation and faith can accomplish what careful planning cannot. The siege was about to become legend. The Janissaries came at dawn on July 22nd, and they came like they always did, with discipline that made them the most feared infantry in the world. The assault columns moved through the pre-dawn darkness in perfect formation, each unit knowing exactly where to strike, which breach to exploit, how to coordinate with adjacent forces. These weren't conscripts or feudal levies stumbling toward battle. These were slave soldiers taken as children, converted to Islam, and trained for a single purpose: to break whatever their sultan commanded them to break. They'd broken Constantinople's defenses. They'd broken every fortress from Anatolia to the Balkans. Belgrade's shattered walls would be just another entry in a long history of inevitable victories. Mehmed II watched from his command position as the assault developed according to plan. The bombardment had done its work. Sections of Belgrade's walls lay in rubble, creating multiple breach points that would divide the defenders' attention and prevent concentrated resistance. The artillery had shifted to suppressive fire, keeping the Christian defenders pinned while the Janissaries advanced. Everything was proceeding with the mechanical precision that Ottoman military excellence demanded. Inside Belgrade, Hunyadi positioned his forces at the breach points with the grim calculation of someone distributing insufficient resources against overwhelming need. He had perhaps 20,000 defenders now, counting garrison troops, his professional soldiers, and Capistrano's peasant crusaders. The Ottomans were throwing approximately 40,000 men at the initial assault, with tens of thousands more in reserve. The mathematics were brutal. Hold every breach point with fewer men than the enemy could concentrate at any single location, or watch the fortress fall when any position collapsed. The Janissaries hit the breaches like a hammer against cracked stone. They came with ladders and siege equipment, but mostly they came with swords and the absolute conviction that walls meant nothing when you had the numbers and discipline to overwhelm any defense. The initial clashes were savage, hand-to-hand fighting in rubble-strewn breach points where neither side could maneuver, and victory went to whoever could sustain casualties longer. Hunyadi's veterans held. Barely. They'd fought Ottomans for years and understood that Janissaries won through discipline and coordinated pressure, so breaking their rhythm was essential. The defenders used the rubble itself as defensive positions, created choke points that prevented the Ottomans from bringing their numerical advantage to bear, and fought with the desperate knowledge that if they broke, everyone in Belgrade died or became slaves. Capistrano's peasants, meanwhile, were discovering that religious fervor was an inadequate substitute for military training. The friar had positioned them as reserves behind the professional soldiers, and when Janissaries broke through at one breach point, the peasant crusaders found themselves facing the Ottoman Empire's finest troops in close combat. They should have been slaughtered. Some of them were, but others fought with the unhinged ferocity of people who'd been told they were divinely protected, and sometimes unhinged ferocity accomplishes what tactical sophistication cannot. The battle raged for hours. Breach points changed hands multiple times as Janissaries pushed forward. Defenders counterattacked, Ottomans reinforced, Christians fell back and rallied. The fortress became a labyrinth of small, brutal fights where unit cohesion disappeared, and combat devolved into individual survival. Hunyadi was everywhere, organizing counterattacks, rallying broken units, personally leading charges when critical positions needed reinforcement. He was 50 years old and exhausted before the battle even started, but he moved like a man half his age because collapsing meant dying, and dying meant Belgrade fell. By mid-morning, the Ottomans had established footholds inside the fortress at multiple breach points. Janissaries were fighting in Belgrade streets, expanding their penetrations, working to link up separate breaches into a unified breakthrough that would split the defense. Mehmed could taste victory. The fortress was breaking, the defenders were being pushed back, and soon the Sipahi cavalry could pour through to finish the slaughter. Then something unexpected happened. The Janissaries faltered. Not routed, not panicked. Janissaries didn't panic, but their advance stalled as casualty rates exceeded even their iron discipline's tolerance. Hunyadi's defenders were killing Ottomans at a ratio that made continued assault mathematically unsustainable. The breaches became killing grounds, where attacking forces died faster than they could be replaced. The Janissary commanders, recognizing that persistence meant destroying their elite units for marginal gains, began pulling back to consolidate and reorganize. Mehmed, watching the assault stall, made a decision that should have been decisive. He would lead a personal counterattack to break the deadlock. The Sultan himself would go to the front, rally his forces, and demonstrate that Ottoman victory was inevitable through his mere presence. It was the kind of gesture that inspired armies and broke enemy morale, the commander-in-chief risking himself alongside his soldiers. It nearly worked. Mehmed's appearance at the breach points reinvigorated the Ottoman assault. Janissaries who'd been pulling back surged forward again. Fresh units committed to the attack with renewed ferocity. For a brief window, the siege's outcome hung in balance. If the Ottomans could capitalize on this momentum, Belgrade would fall within hours. Then Mehmed was wounded. The exact circumstances are disputed. Some sources say an arrow, others claim a spear thrust. One report suggests a stone from the walls. What's not disputed is that the Sultan took a serious injury to his leg or thigh, serious enough that he had to be evacuated from the front lines and taken back to the Ottoman camp for treatment. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Ottoman soldiers who'd been advancing saw their Sultan carried away bleeding, and suddenly the assault's inevitability evaporated. If the Sultan could be wounded, maybe the defenders weren't broken. If God allowed their leader to be struck down, maybe divine favor wasn't guaranteed. The attack didn't collapse immediately. Ottoman discipline was too strong for that, but it lost momentum, became cautious, stopped pressing with the aggressive certainty that had been driving the assault. Inside Belgrade, Hunyadi recognized the moment and seized it. He organized a general counterattack, throwing his reserves into the breach points, while the Ottomans were psychologically off balance. The defenders pushed forward with desperate energy, reclaiming rubble-strewn ground, driving the Janissaries back through the breaches they'd fought so hard to establish. By afternoon, the Ottoman assault had been repulsed. The Janissaries withdrew to their siege lines, having suffered shocking casualties for limited gains. Mehmed was recovering in his tent, furious about the wound and what it meant for his army's morale. The siege continued, but the day that should have seen Belgrade's fall instead became a defensive victory that nobody had thought possible. July 22nd ended with both sides regrouping. The Ottomans had lost thousands of elite Janissaries and failed to take the fortress despite overwhelming numerical advantage. The defenders had held but were exhausted, running low on ammunition and supplies, and understood that surviving one assault didn't mean they could survive the next one. Mehmed would come again, and next time he'd be even more determined to prove that Constantinople's conqueror couldn't be defeated by a Hungarian fortress. But the psychological balance had shifted. The Ottomans had believed Belgrade would fall like Constantinople. Now they knew the siege would be costly, that victory wasn't guaranteed, that the defenders were more formidable than intelligence had suggested. And Mehmed's wound, however minor it turned out to be, had demonstrated that even the mighty Sultan was mortal. Hunyadi used the respite to reorganize defenses and distribute ammunition. Capistrano used it to deliver sermons claiming divine intervention had saved the fortress. The peasant crusaders, having survived their first real battle, were either terrified or convinced of their divine protection, depending on individual temperament. The professional soldiers were simply grateful to be alive and preparing for the next assault. What nobody expected, what changed everything, was what happened the following day, July 23rd. Capistrano had been preaching continuously to the peasant crusaders, building their religious fervor to fever pitch with sermons about divine protection and sacred duty. The friar had no military training, no understanding of tactics, and apparently no concept of how sieges actually worked. What he had was thousands of peasant volunteers who believed him when he said God would deliver victory if they simply had faith and attacked. In the early afternoon of July 23rd, exactly when is disputed, some of Capistrano's crusaders began leaving the fortress. Not in organized formations, not under Hunyadi's command, but in spontaneous groups motivated by religious fervor and the friar's preaching. They started attacking the Ottoman siege lines, apparently believing divine protection made them invulnerable. It was insane. It violated every principle of defensive siege warfare. A garrison defending fortifications had enormous advantages over attacking forces. Leaving those fortifications to attack a numerically superior enemy in open field combat was suicide. Except the Ottoman forces at the siege lines weren't expecting a sortie. They'd just survived a brutal assault on July 22nd, were recovering from heavy casualties, and were psychologically off balance from seeing their sultan wounded. When thousands of screaming peasants came pouring out of Belgrade carrying crude weapons and religious banners, the Turkish troops at the forward positions panicked. Hunyadi saw what was happening and faced an impossible decision. He could try to recall Capistrano's crusaders, probably fail because they weren't under military discipline, and watch them be slaughtered outside the walls. Or he could commit his professional forces to support the mad attack, abandoning the defensive advantage Belgrade's walls provided, and gamble everything on a field battle against superior Ottoman numbers. He chose the gamble, because sitting in Belgrade while the peasants died would destroy whatever morale remained, and because sometimes tactical insanity creates opportunities that careful planning cannot. He ordered the gates opened, led his professional soldiers out of the fortress, and attacked the Ottoman siege lines with everything he had. The battle that followed was chaos approaching the sublime. There was no battle plan, no coordinated strategy, just thousands of Christians attacking Ottoman positions with religious fury, while Hunyadi tried to impose some tactical coherence on complete disorder. The peasant crusaders hit the forward siege positions like a religious tsunami, overwhelming Turkish troops through sheer unexpected ferocity. Hunyadi's veterans followed, turning the peasants' chaotic assault into something approaching a coordinated attack. The Ottomans, caught completely off guard, began retreating from the forward siege lines to more defensible positions. What should have been an orderly tactical withdrawal became increasingly chaotic as panic spread through units that saw their positions being overrun by forces that shouldn't exist. Defenders who were supposed to be trapped in a fortress were somehow attacking in open field combat. The retreat became a rout. Ottoman units that had been preparing for another assault on Belgrade were suddenly fighting for survival against an enemy that had appeared from nowhere. The disciplined siege force became a panicked mob as the psychological shock of the unexpected attack shattered unit cohesion. Mehmed, recovering from his wound, tried to rally his forces. He ordered his commanders to establish defensive lines, to use the army's numerical superiority to contain and destroy the Christian sortie. But battlefield communication was primitive. The situation was developing too fast for coordinated response, and his troops were fleeing faster than orders could reach them. By nightfall of July 23rd, the impossible had happened. The Ottoman siege of Belgrade had collapsed. not through careful defensive planning or superior Christian tactics, but through a spontaneous peasant charge that nobody had ordered, nobody could control, and nobody had believed could possibly succeed. The Ottoman army withdrew south, having lost thousands of men, vast amounts of siege equipment, and, most devastating, the psychological certainty that had driven their conquests. Mehmed II, who'd conquered Constantinople at age 21, had been defeated at Belgrade at age 24 by a 70-year-old friar and a 50-year-old Hungarian commander leading an army of peasants that shouldn't have existed. Inside Belgrade, Hunyadi and his exhausted soldiers processed what had just occurred. They'd won. Against impossible odds, against the greatest army in the world, against every military prediction and strategic calculation, they'd won. The fortress held. The Ottomans were retreating. Christian Europe had survived. Capistrano claimed divine intervention, and given what had just happened, even the skeptics had trouble arguing. The friar's religious fervor had accomplished what military professionalism alone probably couldn't. It had created the psychological weapon that shattered Ottoman morale at the critical moment. But the victory's architect was Hunyadi. He'd assembled an army when the kingdom refused to help. He'd broken the river blockade when conventional wisdom said it was impossible. He'd held Belgrade's walls through the Janissary assault. And when the mad peasant charge created an opportunity, he'd recognized it instantly and committed everything to exploit it. The news would reach Rome within weeks, spreading across Christian Europe like wildfire. Pope Calixtus III, overwhelmed with joy, would order church bells rung at noon every day to commemorate Belgrade's deliverance, a custom that continues in many churches 5.5 centuries later. Mehmed II would return to Constantinople, humiliated, nursing both his physical wound and the deeper wound to Ottoman prestige. The siege that should have opened Christian Europe to conquest had instead proven that the Ottomans could be beaten, that their expansion wasn't inevitable, that one brilliant commander with insufficient resources could still change history. John Hunyadi, the Wallachian nobody who'd become Hungary's savior, had delivered the greatest victory of his career. He'd bought Christian Europe 70 years. The Ottomans wouldn't seriously threaten Hungary again until long after everyone who'd fought at Belgrade was dead. He had 11 days left to live. The first cases appeared on July 25th, 2 days after the victory. The symptoms were unmistakable to anyone who'd lived through medieval plagues. Fever that burned through men like wildfire, swelling in the lymph nodes that meant death was coming, the characteristic stench of bodies breaking down from the inside. Plague had come to Belgrade, carried in the close quarters where thousands of soldiers had fought, bled, and died together. Or perhaps it had been festering in the Ottoman siege camps and spread during the final chaotic battle when Christian and Turkish forces had mixed in desperate close combat. The origin didn't matter. The plague was here, and it didn't care who'd won the siege. The doctors, such as they were in 1456, counseled immediate evacuation. Get the army out of Belgrade. Before the pestilence spread further, disperse the forces before thousands died from disease after surviving the Turkish assault. It was medically sound advice that ignored the political and military reality. Abandoning Belgrade immediately after the greatest Christian victory in decades would look like retreat, would embolden the Ottomans to return, would waste everything they'd just accomplished. Hunyadi made the decision to stay, partially because Belgrade needed garrisoning and organizing after the siege, partially because fleeing plague looked weak and weakness invited Ottoman retaliation, but mostly because he was John Hunyadi, and his entire career had been built on not abandoning positions when circumstances turned difficult. He'd held impossible frontiers, fought hopeless battles, and refused to accept that some things were inevitable. Plague was just another enemy, and you didn't defeat enemies by running. The decision killed him. The disease spread through the camp, with the efficiency that only plague could achieve. Soldiers who'd survived Janissary assaults died in their tents, burning with fever. The peasant crusaders who'd broken the Ottoman siege began dying by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Capistrano's religious fervor couldn't protect against bacteria. The friar himself would contract the plague and die weeks later, though he'd survive long enough to see Hunyadi's death first. By early August, Hunyadi was showing symptoms. The fever came first, the kind that made men delirious and turned simple movement into agony. Then the swelling, buboes in the lymph nodes that meant the body was losing its war against infection. The physicians applied the medieval remedies that accomplished nothing. Bloodletting, prayer, herbal concoctions that might have helped if plague was caused by humoral imbalance rather than Yersinia pestis. He knew he was dying. The fever gave him clarity in brief windows between delirium, and in those moments, Hunyadi understood that he'd survived 3 decades of Turkish warfare only to be killed by an invisible enemy he couldn't fight or outmaneuver. There was a certain dark irony to it. The man who'd beaten the Ottomans at their own game, who'd saved Christian Europe through tactical brilliance, was being destroyed by the same pestilence that had ravaged Europe for centuries, regardless of military genius. His younger son Matthias was there, 12 years old, and watching his father die. The boy had been at Belgrade during the siege, had seen the Janissary assault and the miraculous peasant charge, had watched his father command armies and break Ottoman sieges. Now he was watching Hunyadi reduced to a fever-racked body in a camp bed, surrounded by physicians who could do nothing but witness. The political implications were catastrophic and immediate. Hunyadi was the thread holding together Hungary's defenses, the one commander the Ottomans genuinely feared, the military genius whose tactical innovations had given Christian forces a fighting chance. His death would create a power vacuum that Hungary's fractious nobility would immediately exploit. Ulrich of Chelyabinsk and the other magnates who'd resented Hunyadi's power would move against his family before the body was cold. Everything he'd built, the defensive networks, the professional army, the strategic positions, would be torn apart by aristocrats more interested in factional advantage than Ottoman threats. Hunyadi spent his final coherent moments trying to arrange for Hungary's continued defense. He couldn't prevent the political chaos that would follow his death. Medieval power structures didn't work that way, but he could try to ensure his life's work wasn't completely erased. He extracted promises from the commanders around his deathbed, oaths that they'd maintain the border defenses and protect his family. Medieval oaths meant approximately as much as the speaker's current interests, but it was all he could do. On August 11th, 1456, 22 days after the greatest victory of his career, John Hunyadi died of plague in the fortress of Zemun, just across the river from Belgrade. He was approximately 50 years old, though exact birth dates for people of his origins weren't carefully recorded. He'd spent roughly 3 decades fighting the Ottoman Empire, had risen from Wallachian obscurity to become Regent of Hungary, had won battles nobody thought Christians could win, and had bought Christian Europe time it desperately needed through sheer, bloody-minded excellence at warfare. The death was announced throughout Hungary with the kind of carefully managed messaging that medieval politics demanded. To the common people, Hunyadi was presented as a martyr who'd given his life defending Christendom. Technically true if you ignored that plague rather than Turkish weapons had killed him. To the nobility, his death was presented as tragic, but ultimately opening the way for proper aristocratic governance to return. The Wallachian upstart was gone, and power could flow back to families who'd held it for generations. The bells tolled across Hungary. They were ringing for Hunyadi, but also for Belgrade, because Pope Calixtus III had ordered churches throughout Christendom to ring their bells at noon daily to commemorate the victory. The custom would outlive everyone who'd fought at the siege, would continue for centuries, even as the original context was forgotten, would become one of those religious traditions whose origins required historical explanation. Every day at noon, church bells would ring because a Wallachian commander and a Franciscan friar had held a fortress against impossible odds. The immediate aftermath of Hunyadi's death was exactly as chaotic as he'd feared. His elder son, Ladislaus Hunyadi, in his early 20s, tried to maintain his father's political position and military authority. He had some of his father's tactical skill, but none of his political cunning, and medieval Hungarian politics rewarded cunning more than battlefield competence. Ulrich of Celje immediately began maneuvering to destroy the Hunyadi family's influence, seeing an opportunity to eliminate rivals while they were vulnerable. The conflict came to a head within months. Ladislaus Hunyadi, believing Ulrich was plotting against him, probably correctly, killed Ulrich in November 1456. Whether this was assassination or a brawl that escalated depends on which source you trust, but the result was the same. Ladislaus had murdered one of the kingdom's most powerful nobles, and King Ladislaus V used the killing as justification to arrest both Hunyadi's sons. The Hunyadi brothers were imprisoned in Buda. Ladislaus the Elder was executed in March 1457, despite having arguably acted in self-defense against Ulrich's plots. The king and his advisors wanted to break the Hunyadi family's power permanently, to ensure that no Wallachian upstart could threaten aristocratic dominance again. Matthias, the younger son who'd watched his father die at Zemun, was spared execution, partially because he was still a child, partially because even medieval politics sometimes balked at killing 12-year-olds for their brother's actions. But imprisonment and execution of John Hunyadi's sons created a political backlash the king hadn't anticipated. The Hungarian nobility might have resented Hunyadi's power, but they'd also recognized his competence. His sons were being destroyed not for incompetence or treason, but for having insufficient aristocratic pedigree and threatening established families. The message was clear. Military genius and service to the kingdom mattered less than bloodlines and political connections. Moreover, the common people remembered Belgrade. They remembered who'd organized the defense when the nobility had refused to mobilize. They remembered who'd broken the Ottoman siege that would have meant enslavement and death for thousands. The Hunyadi family might not have proper aristocratic credentials, but they delivered victory when proper aristocrats had delivered only excuses. King Ladislaus V, having executed the elder Hunyadi son and imprisoned the younger, apparently believed he'd successfully neutralized a dangerous family and could return to normal governance. He died in November of 1457, age 17, possibly from plague or possibly poisoned by political enemies. Medieval sudden deaths were always suspicious and rarely conclusively explained. His death created another succession crisis, and this time the Hungarian nobility made a choice that would have shocked everyone a decade earlier. In January 1458, they elected Matthias Hunyadi as King of Hungary. The 15-year-old son of a Wallachian commander whose brother had been executed and who'd spent months imprisoned became king through a combination of popular support, political maneuvering by his uncle Michael Szilágyi, and the nobility's recognition that the Hunyadi name still carried more weight than any aristocratic pedigree. Matthias Corvinus, as he became known, taking a Latinized royal name, would rule Hungary for 32 years. He'd become one of the kingdom's greatest monarchs, a Renaissance prince who patronized arts and learning while maintaining the military excellence his father had pioneered. He'd use the tactical innovations John Hunyadi had developed, would continue defending Hungary against Ottoman threats, would build on the foundation his father had laid through 3 decades of impossible warfare. But in August 1456, none of that was predictable. In August 1456, there was only a body in Zemun, plague spreading through the camp, and the question of whether John Hunyadi's life's work would survive his death. The bells of Belgrade rang at noon. They still ring today in churches across the world. though most people who hear them don't know they're commemorating a siege from 1456, don't know about the Wallachian commander who saved Christian Europe, don't know that medieval history's trajectory changed because one man refused to accept that some battles couldn't be won. Hunyadi was buried with honors appropriate to his station and achievements, though the exact location became unclear over subsequent centuries. The plague had consumed his body, but the legend had already begun spreading. Stories about the White Knight who'd terrified Ottoman sultans, about the defender of Christendom who'd held impossible positions through tactical genius and sheer determination, about the Wallachian nobody who'd become the savior of Europe. The Ottomans remembered him too. Mehmed II, humiliated at Belgrade, would spend the next decades conquering the Balkans and building the Ottoman Empire to its greatest extent. But he never again tried to invade Hungary with the confidence he'd brought to Belgrade. The memory of Hunyadi and the shocking defeat that had resulted from underestimating him created a psychological barrier that lasted generations. The Ottomans would eventually threaten Vienna, would eventually push deep into Hungary, but not until everyone who'd fought at Belgrade was long dead and the lessons learned there had been forgotten. In the immediate aftermath, though, there was just death and uncertainty. The greatest Christian commander of his generation was gone. His family was being destroyed by political enemies. The kingdom he'd defended was descending into faction fighting, and the Ottomans, though defeated at Belgrade, remained the dominant military power in the region, waiting for Hungary's internal chaos to create new opportunities. What nobody knew in August 1456 was that Hunyadi's legacy would prove more durable than anyone expected, that his tactical innovations would influence European warfare for centuries, that his son would become a legendary king, that the defense of Belgrade would be remembered as one of history's decisive battles, the moment when Ottoman expansion into Central Europe was checked and Christian civilization was given the breathing room it needed to survive and eventually flourish. But that's the benefit of historical hindsight, the luxury of knowing how the story ends. In August 1456, there was only plague, death, and the uncertain future that follows when great men die and leave chaos in their wake. The White Knight was gone. The legend was just beginning. And the bells of Belgrade would ring at noon for the next 500 years, marking the moment when one man's refusal to accept defeat changed the course of civilization. The irony was almost too perfect. The Wallachian upstart's bloodline would sit on Hungary's throne for a generation, while the aristocrats who'd scorned him faded into historical footnotes. Matthias Corvinus was crowned King of Hungary on January 24, 1458, at age 15. The coronation was irregular. The proper crown jewels were in Habsburg custody, so they used a substitute crown, which medieval legitimacy-obsessed nobility considered scandalous. The election itself had been contested, with factions supporting various candidates with better bloodlines and worse prospects. But Matthias had something none of his rivals possessed. He was John Hunyadi's son, and in 1458 that mattered more than any pedigree document. The boy king inherited his father's kingdom and his father's problems. The Ottoman Empire, though checked at Belgrade, remained the dominant power in the region. The Hungarian nobility were as fractious as ever, viewing royal authority as something to be negotiated rather than obeyed. The treasury was depleted from continuous warfare. The southern defenses, despite John Hunyadi's efforts, required constant maintenance and reinforcement that nobody wanted to fund. But Matthias also inherited something more valuable: his father's reputation and the tactical legacy that came with it. The young king had watched John Hunyadi command armies, had absorbed lessons about warfare that couldn't be taught in any academy, had seen firsthand how superior strategy could overcome numerical disadvantages. He'd been at Belgrade during the siege, had watched peasant crusaders break Ottoman lines, had witnessed his father turn impossible defensive situations into victories through sheer tactical brilliance. The first years of Matthias's reign were consumed with consolidating power against nobles who believed a teenage king could be manipulated or overthrown. His uncle Michael Szilágyi, who'd been instrumental in securing Matthias's election, expected to serve as the true power behind the throne. He discovered that the Hunyadi talent for ruthless pragmatism had passed to the next generation. Matthias outmaneuvered Szilágyi politically, marginalized him from real authority, and eventually had him executed when he became a threat. It was cold-blooded but effective, exactly the kind of political calculation John Hunyadi had practiced when dealing with threats to Hungarian security. Matthias built the Black Army, a standing professional force of mercenaries that represented the evolution of everything John Hunyadi had pioneered. Where his father had cobbled together armies from noble levies and frontier troops, Matthias created a permanent military force loyal to the crown, rather than aristocratic families. The Black Army used the tactical innovations John Hunyadi had developed: integrated cavalry and infantry, war wagons as mobile fortifications, effective use of early gunpowder weapons, and the sophisticated combined arms doctrine that had made Hunyadi so dangerous to Ottoman commanders. The army was expensive. Maintaining 20,000 to 30,000 professional soldiers required taxation that made the Hungarian nobility furious. But it was also effective. Matthias used it to secure Hungary's borders, to project power into neighboring territories, and to ensure that aristocratic families couldn't challenge royal authority through private armies. It was the professionalization of warfare that John Hunyadi had begun on the frontier, now elevated to kingdom policy and backed by centralized state power. Against the Ottomans, Matthias fought with his father's tactical sophistication, but with resources John Hunyadi had never possessed. The Black Army gave him the ability to respond to Turkish threats without waiting for noble levies that might not materialize. He fortified the southern frontier with a systematic thoroughness his father had advocated but couldn't fully implement. He built the intelligence networks that provided early warning of Ottoman movements, the same networks John Hunyadi had developed, but on a larger scale, with better funding. The Ottomans, for their part, approached Hungary with caution that hadn't existed before Belgrade. Mehmed II, who'd conquered Constantinople and expanded Ottoman territory across the Balkans, treated Hungary as a military problem, requiring careful planning rather than inevitable conquest. The memory of Hunyadi, the commander who'd beaten Ottoman armies repeatedly, who'd broken the siege that should have opened Europe to conquest, created a psychological deterrent that lasted decades. When Ottoman forces did probe into Hungarian territory, they encountered Matthias using his father's tactical playbook. The war wagons that had broken Turkish cavalry charges at Kosovo and Belgrade. The integrated formations that prevented Ottoman forces from exploiting their traditional advantages. The aggressive counterattacks that turned defensive situations into offensive opportunities. It was John Hunyadi's warfare, refined and deployed with the resources of a kingdom, rather than a frontier commander. Matthias became one of Europe's great Renaissance princes, a patron of arts and learning, a builder of libraries and palaces, a king whose court rivaled any in Christendom for cultural sophistication. But underneath the Renaissance veneer was a military commander who'd learned warfare from the greatest tactical mind of his generation. When diplomacy failed and armies had to march, Matthias Corvinus fought like a Hunyadi. The king commissioned histories of his father's campaigns, ensuring John Hunyadi's achievements were recorded for posterity. These weren't just filial piety. They were political documents establishing the legitimacy of a dynasty founded by a Wallachian commander rather than hereditary aristocrats. The histories emphasized Belgrade, the long campaign, the victories that had saved Christian Europe when proper nobility had failed to mobilize. The message was clear. The Hunyadi family had earned their crown through service and competence, not inherited it through bloodline accident. It was a revolutionary argument in medieval Europe. where power was supposed to flow through ancestry rather than achievement, that Matthias could make this argument and have it accepted, could rule for 3 decades despite lacking the pedigree that supposedly legitimized monarchy, was testament to how completely John Hunyadi had transformed Hungarian politics through military excellence. The tactical innovations John Hunyadi had pioneered spread throughout Europe. Military treatises discussed his use of war wagons, his integration of cavalry and infantry, his defensive tactics against numerically superior forces. Commanders studied his campaigns, trying to understand how he'd beaten the Ottomans when conventional wisdom said Christian armies couldn't match Turkish military sophistication. The Hunyadi method, careful reconnaissance, aggressive defense, exploiting enemy weaknesses rather than confronting their strengths, became influential in European military thinking. The war wagons particularly fascinated military theorists. John Hunyadi had used them as mobile fortifications, creating defensive positions that could be established quickly and that disrupted cavalry charges through sheer physical obstruction. Later commanders would adapt the concept, using wagon formations in different configurations and for different tactical purposes. The Hussites had pioneered wagon warfare earlier in the century, but Hunyadi had refined it specifically for fighting Ottomans and had proven its effectiveness at the highest levels of strategic combat. Belgrade's defense became legendary, the subject of songs and stories across Christendom. The details became increasingly embellished. Medieval chroniclers never let accuracy interfere with a good story. But the core narrative remained. An outnumbered Christian force had defeated the greatest Ottoman army ever assembled through a combination of tactical genius and religious fervor, led by a commander who'd spent his life preparing for exactly that battle. The noon bells continued ringing, the custom spreading to churches that had no direct connection to Belgrade or Hungary. It became one of those religious practices whose origins required historical explanation, a daily reminder of a siege most people couldn't locate on a map. But for those who knew the history, the bells commemorated something profound. The moment when Christian Europe's survival had hung in the balance, and one man's refusal to accept defeat had changed the outcome. John Hunyadi never saw his son crowned king. He died believing his family would be destroyed by aristocratic enemies, that his life's work might not survive the political chaos that followed military commanders' deaths. He couldn't have known that within 2 years his bloodline would control the Hungarian throne, that his tactical innovations would reshape European warfare, that his defense of Belgrade would be remembered as one of history's decisive battles. But history's judgment was clear and unanimous. John Hunyadi had saved Christian Europe. Not through a single battle, though Belgrade was spectacular enough to justify the claim, but through 3 decades of relentless, brilliant warfare that had held back Ottoman expansion during the critical period when European defenses were most vulnerable. He'd bought time, 70 years before the Ottomans seriously threatened Hungary again, time Christian Europe used to strengthen its defenses and develop the military and political systems that would eventually check Ottoman power permanently. The Wallachian nobody who'd risen through competence rather than pedigree, the frontier commander who'd become Regent of Hungary, the tactical genius who'd beaten the Ottomans at their own game, the defender who'd held Belgrade when the greatest sultan in Ottoman history brought overwhelming force against him, the father whose son would become one of Hungary's greatest kings. John Hunyadi had entered history as an outsider who wasn't supposed to matter. He'd left it as the man who'd changed European civilization's trajectory through sheer military excellence and stubborn refusal to accept that some enemies couldn't be beaten. The plague had taken his body in 1456, but the legacy, the tactics, the reputation, the strategic vision, the dynasty, endured long after the flesh had failed. Medieval history was supposed to be about kings and emperors, about bloodlines and inherited power, about aristocrats whose birth entitled them to rule. John Hunyadi's career proved that sometimes, when survival demands it, competence matters more than pedigree. That tactical genius can overcome institutional resistance. That one brilliant commander can hold back empires through intelligence and determination. That the supposed natural order, aristocrats ruling through hereditary right, could be disrupted by individuals who simply refuse to accept their assigned place in the hierarchy. His grave's exact location became uncertain over the centuries, lost to time and political upheavals. But the legend required no physical marker. The noon bells rang in churches across Christendom. His son ruled Hungary with the tactical sophistication learned at his father's side. His campaigns were studied in military academies. His defense of Belgrade was remembered as the moment Ottoman expansion was checked. The White Knight was dead. The Dragon of Wallachia was gone. The defender of Christendom had succumbed to plague rather than Turkish steel. But the legacy lived on, echoing through centuries, reshaping how European commanders thought about warfare, proving that sometimes, when everything seems lost and defeat appears inevitable, one person's refusal to surrender can change the world. The bells toll at noon. They've been tolling for over 5 centuries, and they'll continue tolling as long as there are churches to ring them, commemorating the siege of Belgrade and the man who saved Europe by refusing to accept that some battles couldn't be won. John Hunyadi, the Wallachian upstart, the greatest Christian military commander of his age, the father of a king and the savior of a civilization. The impossible had been his specialty. Victory against overwhelming odds had been his legacy. And history, which judges all things eventually, rendered its verdict clearly. He was exactly what Christian Europe needed, at exactly the moment it needed him most. The story ends with plague and death, as all medieval stories eventually do. But it also ends with triumph, with a civilization saved, with tactical innovations that would influence warfare for centuries, with a son who became a great king and carried forward his father's work. Not bad for a Wallachian nobody who wasn't supposed to matter. Not bad at all. The Ottoman Empire finally took Belgrade in 1521, 65 years after Hunyadi's death. Suleiman the Magnificent, who would become the Ottomans' greatest sultan, brought 250,000 men and modern siege artillery that made Mehmed II's cannons look primitive. The garrison, commanded by competent but not exceptional officers, held for 3 weeks before the inevitable mathematics of siege warfare produced the inevitable result. The fortress that John Hunyadi had defended with 20,000 men against Mehmed's host fell to Suleiman's overwhelming force, and the Danube frontier that Hunyadi had died protecting finally collapsed. But those 65 years mattered. They mattered enormously. In that window, from 1456 to 1521, Europe transformed. The military innovations spread, the tactical doctrines evolved, the political system strengthened, the economic resources accumulated. What had been a vulnerable, fractured Christendom facing an ascendant Ottoman tide became a more unified, militarily sophisticated European civilization capable of resisting Turkish expansion. The breathing room Hunyadi bought wasn't just symbolic. It was the difference between Ottoman armies reaching Vienna in 1456, when Christian defenses were unprepared, and reaching Vienna in 1529, when they were ready to hold. The historical counterfactual haunts the imagination. What happens if Belgrade falls in 1456? If Mehmed II breaks through when Ottoman power is at its zenith and European defenses are at their weakest? The answer probably involves Constantinople's fate replicated across Central Europe, ancient Christian cities falling to Ottoman conquest, populations enslaved or converted, the geography of civilization fundamentally redrawn. Not because the Ottomans were uniquely brutal, medieval warfare was universally savage, but because successful conquest creates momentum that accelerates subsequent conquests. Hunyadi stopped that momentum at Belgrade. He didn't stop Ottoman expansion permanently, that would take centuries and involve far larger forces than one man could command. But he stopped it at the critical moment, in the critical place, against the critical threat. And that was enough. The military historians who study his campaigns consistently reach similar conclusions. John Hunyadi was operating at a level of tactical sophistication that wouldn't become standard in European armies until the early modern period. His integrated combined arms doctrine, cavalry, infantry, and artillery, such as it was in the 1440s-50s, working in coordinated formations, anticipated developments that other commanders would discover generations later. His use of defensive fortifications, the war wagons, combined with aggressive counterattacks, predicted the kind of elastic defense that would become doctrine in later centuries. He was, in modern military terminology, a systems thinker in an era dominated by individual heroics. Where most medieval commanders thought about battles as essentially enlarged duels, knight against knight, with the side having more or better warriors winning, Hunyadi thought about force multiplication, logistics, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare. He understood that winning required more than courage and numbers. It required thinking several moves ahead, exploiting enemy weaknesses, and creating situations where your strengths could be leveraged against their vulnerabilities. The Ottomans recognized this. The Turkish chronicles that mention Hunyadi, and there aren't many, because acknowledging Christian military excellence wasn't what Ottoman historians preferred writing about, consistently treat him differently from other Christian commanders. He's not dismissed as a lucky infidel or a minor nuisance. He's portrayed as a serious threat, a commander who required strategic planning to defeat rather than simple tactical execution. When Ottoman forces operated in Hunyadi's theater, they moved cautiously, prepared for ambushes and counterattacks, anticipated complications that other Christian commanders couldn't create. That reputation outlived him. Ottoman military planning for Hungarian campaigns after 1456 showed a caution that hadn't existed before Belgrade. Commanders who'd watched Mehmed II humiliated at Belgrade didn't forget the lesson. Underestimating Hungarian defenses could produce catastrophic defeats even when numerical advantages seemed overwhelming. That caution, that hesitation, that institutional memory of what Hunyadi had done, all of it contributed to the Ottoman decision to consolidate Balkan conquests rather than immediately pushing toward Vienna after 1456. The personal legacy was equally profound. Matthias Corvinus ruled until 1490, transforming Hungary into one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. His Black Army became legendary, a professional force that could match any army in Christendom, and that regularly defeated Ottoman incursions using tactics refined from his father's campaigns. The Corvinus Library in Buda became one of Europe's great Renaissance collections, second only to the Vatican. The kingdom attracted scholars, artists, and intellectuals from across Europe, becoming a cultural center that belied its geographic position on civilization's frontier. All of this was possible because John Hunyadi had held the line long enough for his son to inherit a kingdom rather than Ottoman ruins. Matthias's cultural achievements, his military reforms, his transformation of Hungary into a Renaissance power, none of it happens if Belgrade falls in 1456 and the subsequent Ottoman invasion succeeds. The Corvinus Golden Age was built on the foundation his father had defended with such desperate excellence. The dynasty didn't last. Matthias died without legitimate heirs in 1490, and the kingdom reverted to aristocratic factionalism that John Hunyadi would have found grimly familiar. But the precedent had been established. Competence could create dynasties, military excellence could overcome aristocratic pedigree, and the son of a Wallachian commander could rule one of Europe's great kingdoms through sheer capability rather than inherited right. That precedent mattered in ways that transcended Hungarian politics. Medieval Europe was supposed to be a fixed hierarchy where birth determined destiny and social mobility was essentially impossible. Hunyadi's career and his son's kingship proved the hierarchy wasn't as fixed as aristocrats claimed. It created a template that ambitious military commanders across Europe studied. Start at the bottom, win battles nobody expects you to win, accumulate power through demonstrated competence, and leverage military success into political authority. The Reformation, which erupted across Europe a generation after Hunyadi's death, would challenge hierarchies far more fundamentally than any military commander could. But the ground was being prepared by examples like Hunyadi's, demonstrations that the supposed natural order of aristocratic supremacy could be disrupted by individuals who refused to accept their assigned positions. The Ottoman Empire eventually eclipsed the memory of Belgrade's defense in its official narratives. Suleiman's conquest of the fortress in 1521 became the story Ottoman historians wanted to tell. The inevitable triumph of Turkish arms over Christian resistance. Mehmed II's failure in 1456 became an embarrassing footnote, mentioned rarely and explained through contingencies and bad luck rather than Christian military excellence. But the Janissaries who'd fought at Belgrade remembered. The Sipahi cavalry who'd been broken by peasant crusaders remembered. The institutional knowledge of the Ottoman military establishment remembered that Hunyadi was dangerous, that Hungarian defenses required careful strategic planning rather than confident assault, that the frontier between Ottoman and Christian territory wasn't as permeable as it appeared on maps. That memory, embedded in Ottoman strategic culture, influenced decision-making for decades. It contributed to the caution that prevented immediate follow-up campaigns after Belgrade. It shaped how Ottoman commanders approached Hungarian operations. It created the psychological space where a smaller, weaker kingdom could survive against a vastly more powerful empire through defensive excellence and tactical sophistication. The European memory was different and more enduring. Belgrade became a symbol, the moment when Ottoman expansion was checked, when Christian military competence proved sufficient to hold the line, when one commander's genius had saved civilization from conquest. The details became increasingly mythologized as the decades passed. Chroniclers added miraculous interventions and divine signs to narratives that were already improbable enough without supernatural enhancement. Hunyadi became a legendary figure, the White Knight whose mere name frightened Turkish sultans, the defender of Christendom whose tactical brilliance was matched only by his personal courage. The historical Hunyadi was more interesting than the legend, a pragmatic, ruthless commander who understood that survival required adapting enemy tactics, who fought political battles as skillfully as military ones, who accumulated power through competence in an era that privileged birth, who died from plague rather than glorious battlefield sacrifice. But legends serve purposes that historical accuracy cannot, and the Hunyadi legend served the crucial purpose of proving that Christian Europe could defend itself against Ottoman conquest. The noon bells continued their daily ringing, spreading to regions that had no connection to Belgrade or Hungary. Parish priests rang the bells at midday because tradition demanded it, often without knowing why the tradition existed. The custom became divorced from its origins, becoming a religious ritual whose historical foundation required scholarly explanation. But the bells still rang, commemorating a siege that had happened centuries earlier, celebrating a victory that had saved a civilization. In Hungary, the memory remained more specific and more personal. Hunyadi became a national hero, the exemplar of Hungarian military excellence, the commander whose brilliance had given the kingdom its greatest victories. His campaigns were studied in military schools. His tactics were analyzed in strategic treatises. His defense of Belgrade was taught as the defining moment when Hungarian courage and intelligence had defeated overwhelming odds. The historical assessment, rendered across centuries of scholarship, remained remarkably consistent. John Hunyadi, was one of medieval Europe's greatest military commanders, operating at a level of tactical sophistication that his contemporaries couldn't match, and that wouldn't become standard until the early modern period. His campaigns demonstrated that the Ottomans, despite their formidable military machine, could be beaten through superior strategy and aggressive defense. His legacy, the tactics, the political precedents, the strategic vision, shaped European history in ways that extended far beyond his lifetime. He entered history as an outsider, a Wallachian of questionable parentage, operating on civilization's frontier. He left it as the savior of Christian Europe, the commander who'd held the line when collapse seemed inevitable, the tactical genius whose innovations would influence warfare for centuries. The body died from plague in 1456 in a fortress near Belgrade, surrounded by the same pestilence that had killed countless thousands across medieval Europe. But the legacy, the tactics that changed warfare, the precedent that challenged aristocratic supremacy, the strategic vision that bought Europe the time it needed to survive, endured long after the flesh had failed. John Hunyadi, the Wallachian nobody, the White Knight of Christendom, the defender of Belgrade, the father of a king, the tactical genius who proved that competence could overcome pedigree and that one brilliant commander could hold back empires. The impossible had been his specialty. Victory against overwhelming odds had been his legacy. And European civilization, which survived the Ottoman onslaught and eventually flourished, owed its survival in part to a man who refused to accept that some battles couldn't be won. The bells toll at noon, 5.5 centuries after Belgrade. They ring in churches across the world, commemorating a siege most people have forgotten and a commander most have never heard of. But they ring still, a daily reminder that sometimes, when everything hangs in the balance and defeat seems certain, one person's refusal to surrender can change the course of history. That's not a bad epitaph for a Wallachian upstart who wasn't supposed to matter. That's not a bad epitaph at all.